Chapter 152, Honored Lady, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Oh my. Perhaps Gong Gong needs a reminder. I've only met Imperial Princess Liao once at the Dingyuan estate. If Imperial Princess Liao lost something, then it should be in the Dingyuan estate. Gong Gong, this is the Jing'an estate. When you came in through the entrance, did you not see the signboard above the doors? The eunuch was close to bursting due to anger. This was the first time that using the names of Imperial Concubine Wei and Imperial Princess Liao hadn't worked. Chu Lian was warning him that Imperial Princess Liao had lost the golden cheline to her. She had to accept her loss if she was willing to use it as a bet in the first place. If she wanted her treasure back, she had to give up something in exchange. This eunuch had just tried to falsely charge her with the crime of taking Imperial Princess Liao's treasure. However, that bet had been carried out under the eyes of everyone at the Dingyuan estate. If it were to get out that Imperial Princess Liao had forcibly demanded her wager back, then it would reflect badly on the princess herself. The eunuch held back his rage and instead tried a different approach. He humbled himself and took out a plain purse from within his sleeve, holding it up with two hands as he tried to pass it over to Chu Lian. Honored lady, this is a gift that Imperial Concubine Wei entrusted to me, for the sake of exchanging for the princess's golden cheline. Chu Lian sent a look to Xian, who quickly returned to Songtao Court to retrieve the golden cheline. Chu Lian had a spark of realization. She didn't really need to be too courteous with this eunuch after all. She took the purse directly and opened it to peek inside before she smiled and said, Gong Gong, rest assured. Although it's something that the princess lost to me, I've kept it in good condition all this time. I'll pass it to you in front of everyone here today, so please look after it properly, Gong Gong. Xian returned quickly with the cheline. The young eunuch took the brocade box from Xian's hands. He then opened it and looked over the contents carefully. After making sure that it was indeed Imperial Princess Liao's golden cheline, he bowed and said, This servant has troubled Honored Lady Genie today. This servant's hopes Honored Lady Genie hasn't taken offense. After the people from the palace had departed, Chu Lian was called to Qingxi Hall by Matriarch He. She only came out of Qingxi Hall about an hour later. On the way back to Songtao Court, Chu Lian thought about what Matriarch He had said to her as she felt a headache about to come on. So she still had to enter the palace to give her thanks for the title bestowed upon her. When she realized that she might even bump into Imperial Princess Liao and Imperial Concubine Wei while at the palace, Chu Lian fell into a slight depression. Were the heavens against her somehow? Xian followed after Chu Lian and was frowning as she thought of the events this morning. She couldn't resist asking, Third young madam, why did you have to say those words after passing that golden cheline over to the eunuch just now? Those words. Oh, right. Her reminder to the eunuch to check the golden cheline. Chu Lian turned around and poked Xian on the forehead. Why, you haven't figured it out yet? Xian replied with a dazed, ah? Chu Lian sighed. Couldn't you tell that the intimidation at the start was all a ploy by that eunuch? Otherwise, how could he have taken out that purse full of banknotes later on? Imperial Princess Liao and Imperial Concubine Wei might not really like her, but as members of the imperial family, if they wanted to take something back, they wouldn't be so shameless as to come empty-handed. Imperial Concubine Wei was of such high status that it would be beneath her to deal with a mere honored lady in such a shameless manner. The eunuch had been given those banknotes to buy back the golden cheline, but he had probably gotten greedy and thought to keep the money. This was likely why he had tried to use the name of Yonghe Hall to threaten Chu Lian into giving the cheline back. How could he have known that Chu Lian wasn't going to be taken in by his empty threat at all? As for why she specially asked the eunuch to check over the golden cheline before leaving, she was afraid that he would do something to it and cause a misunderstanding between her and Imperial Concubine Wei for revenge. Though he might not be able to do that anymore, she had definitely offended him today. That eunuch would probably add his own embellishments when he reported back to the Imperial Concubine and Princess. There was a phrase that fit this situation perfectly well: it was better to offend a gentleman than a petty person. TL note, some shameless promotion of a bunch of sad short stories I translated a while back. http://Novels. Zisanyu's short stories. These stories were all written by one author, with sad themes. We have a bird who wants to become human, a woman who waits for her lover to reincarnate, and a child talking about how she hates her mother. Give them a try. 3. Chapter 153, Letters from Home, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. However, even if Chu Lian hadn't accepted the money today, the eunuch probably would have looked down on her anyway. Either action would have led to the same result, so why not let him know that she wasn't someone he could bully? Even if he wanted to play his sneaky tricks on her next time, he would think twice before trying it again. Chu Lian's words made Xian come to a sudden realization. So it wasn't such a simple event after all. There were all these unseen twists in the middle of it. Chu Lian was a little down now. Anyone else would be pretty happy after getting a noble title, but she wasn't the slightest bit elated. Conversely, she was deep in worry. Who would want this honored lady title? Royal Princess Duanjia had done her a disservice with this move. What Chu Lian didn't know was that this surprise gift hadn't come about with just the efforts of Princess Wei and Royal Princess Duanjia. Prince Jin had also helped out in getting her this title. When she returned to Songtao Court and saw the parlor full of gifts from the bestowal of her honored lady title, she waved her hands and had senior servants Gui and Zhong take care of it. Although she hadn't been given an accompanying medal or token of immunity along with the noble title, the emperor had personally picked out a name for her. That honor meant that she could stand on par with any feudal princess now. An honored lady was given a set of appropriate dresses for court gatherings and their matching headdresses. Other than that, she had also been given a small estate in the capital, about 6 hectares of good farmland and 100 pieces of gold. These were all part of the standard awards for an honored lady. Other than the special name genie, the emperor hadn't added on anything more. Chu Lian pointed at the headdresses and said a little helplessly, "Place those together with the phoenix tail hairpin that royal princess gave to me." Now that she had a noble title, she could wear the simplest phoenix tail hairpin and no one would say anything bad about her. Senior servant Gui held up a stack of court dresses. "Third young madam, why don't you try these on? If they don't fit, we have to adjust them as early as possible." Chu Lian had suffered a series of shocks and surprises this morning, so she wasn't in the mood to play dress up. Furthermore, these court dresses were made out of cloud pattern brocade and were extremely thick. If she tried them on, she would probably start sweating. "I'll try them tomorrow." Senior servant Gui could only put away the clothes. Chu Lian returned to her own little study and took out the purse that the eunuch had given her. She had only taken a short glance inside just now, and estimated that there was about 800 taels inside. After carefully counting, she realized that there were actually over 1,200 taels worth of banknotes inside. Imperial concubine Wei really didn't lack money at all. Exchanging that golden cheline had earned her quite the tidy sum. She handed the banknotes to Xian to keep safely together with the rest of her savings. Then, Chu Lian drank a bowl of sweet soup, had a quick bath, and settled down for a nap. Matriarch he gave senior servant Liu some instructions as she slowly savored a bowl of bird's nest soup. Send someone over to Darlang's wife and have her make 2 more outfits suitable for a 5th-ranked noble wife for Sanlang's wife. And also, have her make 2 more phoenix tail hairpins. Senior servant Liu voiced her acknowledgement of the orders, but didn't immediately send someone off to execute them. She stood by Matriarch his side as if she had something to say but did not dare to speak up. Matriarch he cast a sideways glance at her. "Why? Do you think this old woman isn't being fair to Darlang's wife? This old servant doesn't dare to question madam." Matriarch he set down the jade bowl in her hands and said, "Shang Yun, I've given her enough time. Darlang can't go without a male heir. If Darlang's wife can't even hold herself together over this small matter, then how will she face the day that Darlang takes a concubine? Darlang will be the one to shoulder the responsibility of taking care of this family in the future." Upon hearing Matriarch his words, senior servant Liu suppressed the concerns that she had wanted to bring up. She simply agreed with the matriarch and turned to do her bidding. When Madame Zhu received the news, she couldn't hold back her rage and immediately threw a teacup to the ground, scaring the trembling maidservant who had passed on the message. However, as angry as she was, She couldn't disobey Matriarch his orders. She tried her best to suppress the fire in her heart. At night, when Dalang tried to initiate intimacy with her, she didn't have the mood to acquiesce. Although both husband and wife slept on the same bed, they had different thoughts in mind this night. Chapter 154, Letters from Home, 2. In the northern border at Liangju, the weather was growing colder since the start of August. While the nobles in the capital were still donning summer garments, the people in Liangju had to put on a thick coat to step outside. In the simple city of Liangju, there was an unassuming little courtyard with only 3 rooms and an open-air kitchen and a stack of freshly cut firewood next to that kitchen. There was still a small fire lit up on the range in the kitchen. White smoke was drifting upwards from the range while a strange smell was coming from the pot on the stove. At this moment, a person stood up from behind the range with a face full of soot. The entrance to the courtyard was pushed open with a creak, and a young man with a full beard stepped in. He was dressed in black with a sword at his waist. Although he seemed a little dusty and worn from his travels, there was a resolute light in his eyes. The soot-faced man quickly ran over to welcome his master. "Third young master, you're finally back. Quick, come into the room to rest. The meal will be done soon." Lai Yu took the package off He Changdis' back and the long sword at his waist before leading his master into the main room. This was He Changdis' 10th day in Liangju. This courtyard that he was staying in had been bought just 10 days ago. He Changdi was now darker than when he first entered Liangju. The elegant line of his chin had been completely obscured by a dense beard, but his originally deep eyes had become even more spirited and determined. He had been running all over the city these few days and slimmed down quite a bit. However, his body had become more toned with muscle. If He Sanlang the Fair could be compared to a handsome, tall bamboo tree previously, then the current He Sanlang was now a tall and straight pine standing by a cliff. When Lai Yu saw the dust covering his master, he felt heartache for his master's plight. He served up tea and water before saying, "Young master, rest here in this room for now. This servant will get you some good food to eat." He Sanlang was indeed a little tired by now. He washed his face and hands before resting on a bamboo chair with his eyes closed. It wasn't until a strange smell seeped into the room that He Changdi opened his narrow eyes and looked towards the table. "What is this?" Lai Yu cast a guilty glance at the food on the table and said, "Young master, it's porridge." The corner of He Sanlang's eyes twitched. Could that white and yellow slop with pieces of wheat bran mixed in between be called porridge? It was bad enough that the appearance was so strange. However, there was also a weird smell accompanying this porridge. Lai Yu showed a suffering expression. "Young master, you know that this servant doesn't know how to cook. However, there's also a limit to the food available here in Liangju, so this is the best this servant could do." What Lai Yu didn't say was that they didn't have much money left on them and it wasn't enough to buy any good ingredients at all. Polished rice cost 1,000 coins per kilogram back at the capital. Out here at the border, polished rice cost 10 taels of silver per kilogram. It was bad enough that it was so expensive, but commoners weren't allowed to buy polished rice even if they had the money to do so. Liangju had been embroiled in tussles over the border for years and wasn't well maintained. How could the quality of life here be any good? Since there was a shortage of goods, when Lai Yu had gone shopping earlier today, he had only been able to buy some millet, sorghum, and wheat bran. He couldn't even find any fresh vegetables, fruits, or even wild-caught meat. There was only a single place selling alcohol in this bleak and desolate place. The alcohol was simply some watered-down low-quality wine. TL note, guessing that Lai Yu's porridge might have looked something like this. XD Lai Yu's porridge. Chapter 155, Letters from Home, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Since there was a shortage of goods, when Lai Yu had gone shopping earlier today, he had only been able to buy some millet, sorghum, and wheat bran. He couldn't even find any fresh vegetables, fruits, or even wild-caught meat. There was only a single place selling alcohol in this bleak and desolate place. The alcohol was simply some watered-down low-quality wine. Lai Yu had never needed to cook while serving his young master before. His culinary skills were close to non-existent. Making something edible was already a commendable feat for him. There were monthly raids by the 2 Hun soldiers here and the whole city was almost empty. They were indeed in dire straits. He Changdi glared fiercely at Lai Yu. This manservant was way too useless. How could he be even more pampered than his own master? Lai Yu's legs turned to jelly under that intense stare. He had to summon up enough courage to say, "Young master, if you think that my cooking is bad, then why don't I buy back a maidservant for you tomorrow?" There were plenty of poor families forced to sell their sons and daughters to survive in this city. It was quite cheap to buy a girl to cook and clean for you. He Changdi took up the wooden chopsticks at the side and harumphed. "Buying a maidservant? Are you going to raise her then?" After hearing He Changdi's words, Lai Yu immediately shut up. Although it was only a single maidservant, he couldn't afford to keep her. He had to eat and drink. The money they brought was barely enough for the 2 of them as it was. Too lazy to continue talking to this useless manservant of his, He Changdi held his bowl in hand and took a sip with his brows furrowed. As expected, this porridge tasted as bad as it smelled. Even the Chinese olive porridge made by the barbarians was better. For the sake of keeping his body fueled, He Changdi forced himself to drink down the entire bowl. It wasn't the time to be picky. After the morning market in Liangju closed, there were barely any street stalls or shops open. Even if they wanted to eat something better, they didn't have the money for it. Lai Yu drank down a bowl of porridge with a bitter expression. When he was done, he stared at the empty bowl before him with a blank expression and began talking to himself. If only third young madam were here. Even the lousiest ingredients become heavenly dishes in her hands. As he daydreamed about a heaping bowl of braised meat, Lai Yu felt that he had become even more of a glutton after these few months. "What did you say?" When He Changdi heard Lai Yu's mumbling, he abruptly turned his fearsome gaze onto his dazed manservant. Lai Yu shrunk back and quickly kept silent. He Sanlang glared at him again before standing up and leaving for his room. He had been out the whole day and was really tired by now. Lying on the simple bed made of mud, He Changdi rested with one arm behind his head and one arm on his chest. Perhaps due to Lai Yu's words, what flashed through his mind wasn't the anger, regret, and hatred from his previous life, but the memory of Chu Lian having breakfast in the parlor of Songtao Court. Shrouded by the steam from the food, her face seemed to lack the perverse ruthlessness and eccentricity he had seen before, and she seemed like a totally different person from that wicked woman of his previous life. Even though their faces were exactly the same, he felt that they were completely different people. What in the world was going on? Could the allure of food be that great? So much so that it could change his mind towards someone so sinister and venomous? With an unsettled heart, he shut his eyes before opening again. His thoughts returned to those few meals he had had in Songtao Court. He realized that that wicked woman could use even the most simplest of ingredients to cook up a tasty meal. Those wontons and scallion pancakes he had the other day were just made of flour, vegetables, and some meat. If Chu Lian were here by his side now, what culinary delights could she make with the millet, sorghum, and wheat bran? No matter what, it would surely be delicious. When he realized where his thoughts had led him, He Changdi's slender body abruptly froze up. His expression turned ugly and gloomy. He rubbed his temples in frustration. It must have been his fatigue, coupled with Lai Yu's words. Otherwise, how could he be missing that wicked woman who had condemned him to a life not worth living? Sometimes, it wasn't good to keep talking about others. While He Sanlang was regretting his thoughts and trying to force himself to sleep, a series of furious knocks at the door interrupted him. Young master, the estate sent some letters for you," Lai Yu excitedly exclaimed. Chapter 156, Reading Letters from Home, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. He Changdi immediately stood up and opened the door. The moment he entered the courtyard, he spotted a middle-aged man dressed as a merchant standing in the middle of the open space, carrying a huge bag on his back. After He Changdi took the package from him, the man gave a salute and quickly left. When Lai Yu saw that his master seemed to be so distracted by his own thoughts that he had yet to open the bag, he helpfully reminded, "Young master, quick, open it and see what's inside." He Changdi walked back into the house and placed the bag on top of the table. He gently loosened the strings tying the sack closed and opened it, peeking at the contents inside. The bag had been stuffed full to the brim, and the topmost layer was made up of autumn clothes. These clothes were not the unlined long gowns normally worn by the nobles in the capital. Instead, they were short and made of the most common fabric. For outerwear, there was only a single cloak made of 2 separate pieces. For innerwear, there were a few more sets of inner clothes, as well as socks. These were also made of much higher quality material, since no one would be able to notice them when they were worn on the inside. Other than that, there was also a pair of deerskin boots. They were perfect for this weather, since deerskin was hardy and waterproof. A light flashed in He Sanlang's eyes as he took in the sight of them all. Lai Yu was happy for his master as he looked over all the clothes. He heaped on generous praise as he said, "Third young madam is so considerate. The things she sent are all what young master needs most right now." Chu Lian had done some backpacking before back in the modern world, so she knew what was most needed when out in the wild. Although she had gotten senior servant Gui and Xian to pack things for her, she had looked over the contents and taken out all the useless things like unlined long gowns, fans, and jade amulets. She had changed them out for socks, inner clothes, short gowns, gloves, and so on. They had left in a hurry and in secret, so they didn't bring much with them. The pair of shoes on He Changdi's feet had already been worn out in a few places. It was about time for him to switch to a new pair. The letters were squashed by the clothes inside, so He Changdi carefully pulled out the fragile papers. When Lai Yu noticed the especially huge envelope within, he exclaimed loudly, "Third young madam wrote such a thick letter." After saying so, he chuckled with a silly grin directed at his master. He Sanlang cast a sideways glance at Lai Yu and didn't open Chu Lian's letter in front of him. Instead, he carefully placed it off to one side. There was a smaller package in a corner of the bag. He Changdi pulled the smaller package out and opened it up. Inside was a gourd, some small jars and a few exquisite cloth bags. While finding it strange, he picked up the gourd and gently uncorked it. Instantly, a fragrant, refreshing aroma came drifting out of the gourd. Lai Yu's nose was sharper, as he normally drank quite a lot while out with his young master. He hadn't had a drop of wine in months, so the moment he detected the scent of alcohol in the air, his eyes sparkled. "Young master, this is wine." He Sanlang's eyes glimmered for a moment before he gave a light snort and quickly corked the gourd again. He put it off to the one side that Lai Yu couldn't reach, like he was protecting a little chick from a big bad wolf. Following that, He Sanlang purposely put on a calm facade while opening one of the exquisitely made cloth bags. When the blue bag was opened, the smell of something delicious mixed together with spices permeated the air. He Sanlang cast a measuring gaze over the rest of the bags. He seemed lost in a daze for a moment. Lai Yu was dying of curiosity. He moved closer to his young master and asked in a light tone, filled with expectation, "Young master, what's in this cloth bag? Is it food?" He Changdi was brought back to the real world by Lai Yu's words. The corners of his mouth twitched. He looked over the bags and picked the smallest one out. With an unwilling expression, he tossed it over to Lai Yu before he swiped the rest along with the package and retreated into his own room. Lai Yu was someone who was extremely easy to satisfy. When he received the cloth bag, he couldn't wait and immediately opened it up. He walked over to the door and used the dim light of the evening to look inside before taking a long sniff at it. After confirming that the bag contained jerky, he was delighted. He quickly took out a piece as big as half his palm and bit into it. His mouth chewed at top speed. It was so good that tears almost leaked out from his eyes. Chapter 157, Reading Letters from Home, 2. After using a bag of pork jerky to keep that gluttonous Lai Yu away, He Changdi was finally able to enjoy some peace and quiet in his room. He gently placed the bag of snacks off to the side before sitting down by his desk and taking out his letters. He read the letters from Matriarch He and his eldest brother He Changchi first, then those from Countess Jingan and his best friend Prince Jin. When he noticed that every family member had sung praises of Chu Lian, for the first time, He Changdi wasn't filled with contempt. He gripped the letters in hand, lowered his gaze, and pursed his lips, seemingly lost in thought. After being distracted for a good while, Changdi put the letters from his family aside and opened the letter from Prince Jin. However, the moment he read Prince Jin's 2-page letter, the hard-won sliver of guilt and bafflement from before vanished into thin air, without leaving a single speck behind. Chu Lian. That wicked woman. How dare she? So it was true, it was easier to move mountains and rivers than change a person's nature. He had truly been too naive, thinking that she had actually turned over a new leaf just because she was a bit different from the previous lifetime. Who would have thought that? So a leopard really couldn't change its spot. Xiaobo Jian, Chu Lian. One day. Hell make that cheating couple pay. By the time Sanlang recovered from his episode of overwhelming hatred, Prince Jin's letter was all crumpled up into a ball. When he released his grip on it, the bits of torn paper slipped between his fingertips and scattered, just like snow. Sanlang leaned back against the chair and closed his grudge-filled eyes, only to open them a few moments later. His eyes had darkened, and his aura also changed, becoming colder and stern. Sanlang's gaze lowered, locking onto the huge leather envelope on the table. The sight of it now conjured a sense of ridicule instead of warmth. An icy, mocking snort slipped out from between his lips. Sanlang reached out and tore open the massive envelope with his long, nimble fingers. Although his face was still cold and stern, his slightly trembling fingers exposed his true feelings. His heart was filled with hatred, but his fingers still moved to open the envelope, almost against his own will. He pulled out a thick stack of papers from inside. In his past life, that wicked woman had never written a single letter to him, so he rarely got to see her handwriting. With that, it could be assumed that he, her legal husband, didn't even have a place in her wicked heart. When he opened the letter and saw the simple drawings on the very first page, Sanlang was stunned. His almond-shaped eyes flickered with uncertainty, and he quickly flipped through the next few pages. Damn it! Just like the first page, they were all drawings. Every single one of them. There wasn't a single written word. Despite the simplicity of the artwork, a vivid, lively scene was presented with just a few brushstrokes. But no matter how innocent the picture, Sanlang still wasn't able to contain the rage swirling inside his chest. He slammed his fist against the table, causing the paperweight on the table to flip over twice. Sanlang felt that all the letters he sent to provoke Chu Lian had been completely ignored. His anger was all pent up in his chest, and it was obviously a difficult thing to bear. He got up and paced around the room to try and suppress the raging anger and frustration he felt inside. A long while later, Sanlang gradually calmed down. He once again returned to his desk. When his gaze landed on the stack of drawings, Sanlang sneered. It had been months since they last met, and that wicked woman was getting better and better at acting. A mere stack of drawings had given the whole family a favorable impression of her. They probably thought that the envelope contained thousands upon thousands of words of longing as deep as an endless sea, as if by writing them she wanted to send the entirety of herself over to him. If he hadn't opened it himself, perhaps he would have been fooled by that wicked woman as well. Chapter 158, Reading Letters from Home, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. After taking a few deep breaths, Sanlang once again suppressed the endless waves of anger rising from within him. Once he was calm enough, he picked up the drawings once again and took a proper look at them. But now that he was giving them a good look, Sanlang actually became completely immersed in them. The drawings in Chu Lian's letter were similar to the 4-box manga style of the modern age. Although she didn't include a single word in there, it managed to do a fine job at narrating and expressing exactly what she wanted to. The lack of words didn't have any negative impact on conveying the content. In the drawing, the cutely drawn female lead was Chu Lian herself. On every page, the little girl had different expressions and actions. Sometimes she was angry, sometimes haughty, and sometimes sincere. The expressions and emotions given to the little girl were all lively and fresh. Despite the art's simplicity, it was attractive, and appealed to people in a way that drew others closer to the artist. Actually, there was a reason why Chu Lian had made these comics instead of just writing a reply. She was afraid that she would be exposed by her handwriting, so she had no choice but to draw instead. The contents of the drawings were also quite random. Perhaps due to her professional habits from her previous life, she subconsciously drew each of them with a theme. The comics were all centered around interesting things that happened in her daily life. A single picture could convey more than 1,000 words, and was far more intuitive to understand. Moreover, a manga style like this hadn't appeared in the Great Wu Dynasty before. Looking at these drawings, He Changdi felt like he could envision Chu Lian's everyday life. The lively, happy-go-lucky girl in these drawings deviated greatly from the personality of the insidious, deceitful, wicked woman that he knew her as. A short while later, he abruptly opened his eyes. He hated that he had unwittingly had a change of heart once again. He Sanlang took a deep breath to suppress the strange feeling before his deep gaze landed on the final drawing. In that drawing, a little girl who had her hair tied up in a bun sat on a chair, facing a kind, middle-aged lady. The two were happily chatting away. The middle-aged lady had a benevolent smile, but there was a red patch on the left cheek of her slightly plump, round face. There was also a servant pouring some tea for her. The little girl with the bun had a thought bubble floating on top of her head. There wasn't a word in it, but there was a remarkably detailed portrait of a noble lady with white hair. The noble lady had a kind face, but it wasn't very recognizable. The most notable aspect of her was the phoenix headdress on top of her head, and this phoenix had 9 phoenix tails on it. The noble lady with white hair was smiling brightly with an aura of a saint, and her hand was drawn giving a thumbs up. It went without saying that the little girl with the bun was Chu Lian. That woman felt no shame in drawing herself so cutely. As for the background of the drawing, He Changdi only needed a second to recognize it. It was the Dingyuan estate. A middle-aged woman with a red patch on her face. Anyone in the capital would know that the Northern Border Troops Captain Guo had an extremely ugly wife. However, Captain Guo had nothing but deep respect for his wife. Not only did he treat her as his equal, but he never even took a single concubine. They had 2 sons and 3 daughters together, and were well known in the capital as a couple. The identity of the noble lady in the bubble was even more obvious. It was the current Empress Dowager. There was a rule in the Great Wu Dynasty that only the Empress Dowager was qualified to wear ornaments with 9 phoenix tails. Even the Empress was limited to just 7 phoenix tails. Chu Lian was happily chatting with Captain Guo's wife, while the Empress Dowager was happily showing her approval. What was that wicked woman trying to tell him? The Northern Border Troops were under the command of the Duke of Lu, Great General Qian. Captain Guo was one of his subordinate officers. Although he didn't have the most important position amongst the general's men, he was still close to General Qian. The officers serving in the Northern Border Troops all had actual authority. Captain Guo was brave and fierce, good in battle, and empathetic to the soldiers under his command. He was a great leader who protected his men, and didn't steal credit for deeds that weren't his. Although he had many good points to him, he was also hot-headed and impulsive. It was due to this fatal weakness that General Qian hadn't given him a more important post. TL note: some important changes in names. While translating this chapter, I realized that I made a mistake in translating the names of the dukes in this story. Chu Lian's maiden family is the house of Duke Yingguo, but it should actually be Duke Ying. I didn't realize that Guo is part of the title Duke in Chinese, as the other noble houses all had 2 Chinese characters in their names, i.e. Count Jing'an, Marquis Dingyuan etc. All the chapters before this have already been changed. Duke Yingguo-Duke Ying Duke Shengguo-Duke Sheng. Chapter 159, Reading Letters from Home. 4. He Changdi wouldn't have known about all these military secrets had it not been for the fact that he'd lived it once already. If he threw his lot in with a leader like that and boosted Captain Guo's bravery with his own resourcefulness, General Qian would definitely notice the improvement in Captain Guo. Using that as a chance, he could then make himself known to the Duke of Lu and earn the opportunity to get into his graces. This was He Changdi's current plan for himself. During the past few days, he had kept himself busy coming and going in order to build connections with the Northern Border Troops, all in the hopes of getting posted under Captain Guo. He hadn't mentioned a single word of these secrets to anyone, not even Prince Jin. However, that wicked woman had somehow had the same thoughts as him. He Sanlang had already confirmed that Chu Lian hadn't experienced the same past life that he had, so he was certain that Chu Lian didn't know how events would progress from now on. So why had she sent him a hint like that in such an obscure way? Wasn't her true love Xiao Wujing? Meanwhile, the sleeping Chu Lian back in Songtao court didn't know that her small gesture of kindness had caused the paranoid He Changdi to nearly pull his hair out over the various possibilities. Since she couldn't possibly be clairvoyant, and she hadn't been reincarnated, then He Changdi could only say that that wicked woman Chu Lian was sharper than he had initially thought. He hadn't expected that there was another layer of depth to her intelligence that she had kept secret, even throughout her previous life. All this mystery had erased any shred of gratitude he had ever felt towards her. On the contrary, his caution against her had increased by another level. If Chu Lian found out what chaos her drawings had caused, she would have definitely sprawled out on her bed and beat the mattress a few times with her fists. Please, my dear husband, how does your brain work? If a normal wife were to do such a helpful thing, shouldn't you be heaping praises on her and showering her with your love? How about a compliment or two about being smart and virtuous? Why are you doing the opposite? He Changdi folded up the letter and put it back into the huge leather envelope. Following that, he took it and walked up to the fire burning in the brazier. With a wave of his hand, the envelope landed inside the brazier and was completely surrounded by flames. When he saw that the letter had caught fire, He Sanlang's eyes suddenly dimmed. He reached out at lightning-fast speed and pulled the envelope out of the fire. There was a flurry of activity as he put out the burning envelope. When He Sanlang saw the singed corner, the only evidence to his rash action, there was a strange feeling in his heart. The set of drawings tucked inside appeared in his mind. Had that wicked woman really just been trying to give him a hint? Perhaps the truth wasn't as dark as he thought? Thoughts as messy as the scattered grass of the plains ran through his head. Eventually, he tossed the singed envelope into a wooden box. Out of sight, out of mind. Chu Lian had practiced 2 pages of calligraphy in her little study. After destroying the evidence, she had gone to try on her new court dresses. Senior servant Gui recorded down any parts that hadn't fit in order to alter the dresses herself later. During her daily greetings, Chu Lian made a request to Matriarch He to pay a visit to Guilin restaurant. She wanted to see for herself what state it was in. After finishing all the small tasks, Chu Lian changed into a plain blue dress and brought Wenlan and Wenqing along with her. She boarded the carriage that the estate had already prepared for her and left for Guilin restaurant, accompanied only by a few manservants and guards. Guilin restaurant was located in the Old West Market, which was rather far away from the Jingan estate. The alleys were small and twisty, so it took an hour before they arrived. Chapter 160 Incognito Visit to Guilin Restaurant 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had come down to make an incognito visit today, so she dressed very plainly. Even the carriage she took lacked the House Jingan insignia. Together with the rest of the party, most people would just assume that she was the wife of a low-ranking official. Guilin Restaurant was situated deep in the Old West Market. Ever since the bounds of the West Market had been redrawn by the Ministry of Transport, this whole area had become a part of Anley Lane. Anley Lane was a housing district for civilian families. Back then, a majority of the shops here had been bought, and the land they stood on had been turned into small homes meant for commoners. Never mind the only restaurant, Guilin Restaurant was probably the only business left in the area. Although the ordinary folks on Anley Lane weren't poor, the number of families who could afford to eat at a restaurant wasn't enough. During this period, the cost of having a meal at a restaurant was equivalent to several sumptuous home-cooked meals of fish and meat. Guilin Restaurant didn't have a large customer base to begin with. To make matters worse, its food was so ordinary that it even fell short of the street food outside. Business was obviously very poor. If not for the special meaning this restaurant held to Matriarch He, it would have most likely closed down over 10 years ago. How could a business be allowed to continue operating at a loss? The carriage steadily rode along the alleyways on Anley Lane. It was close to noon, so there was smoke coming out from the chimneys of the houses on the street. There were kids playing in the open and adults carrying bamboo poles loaded with items as they walked by. They had faces full of sweat, but they carried bright and happy smiles. Chu Lian slightly lifted the carriage's curtain and took in the scene of how commoners of the Great Wu dynasty lived with her eyes wide open. It was so fresh and vivid that she couldn't take her eyes off it. She was completely immersed in this reality. When Wenqing noticed that Chu Lian was entranced with the view outside, she thought Chu Lian was running out of patience, so she said, "Third young madam, we're just 2 alleys away from Guilin Restaurant." Wenqing and Wenlan used to live in a manor together with senior servant Zhong. As Wenqing's home was close to Anli Lane, she was the most familiar with this area. She had also passed by Guilin Restaurant several times, but she had never gone in before. Chu Lian let down the blinds and took a sip of the honey water in the teacup before her. She tilted her head to one side and said, "When we reach Guilin Restaurant later, all of you are not to reveal my identity. Understand?" Although Wenqing and Wenlan were curious about the reason behind third young madam's order, they were smart enough not to question it. They nodded and agreed in unison. As expected, the gently shaking carriage reached the entrance to Guilin Restaurant in just a moment. Guilin Restaurant was situated at a bend in the corner of the street. In the original West Market, it was a great position, but after it became a residential area, the surrounding businesses closed one after another and Guilin Restaurant was the sole business that remained. There was a certain quaint charm to Anli Lane, but it was a pity that there was very little human traffic. The people who did pass by were mostly commoners who ate at home. Chu Lian got off the carriage with Wenqing supporting her. She raised her head slightly to take in the sight of Guilin Restaurant. Perhaps due to the uniform buildings of the West Market in the past, Guilin Restaurant's entrance wasn't that big, and it only had a single floor. The sandalwood signboard had the words Guilin Restaurant drawn on it with black ink, and the calligraphy looked bold and charismatic. It was inviting and gave off the feeling of being free with the wind. However, the signboard was also aged and mottled, with peeling paint all over, making the restaurant look decrepit. This was obviously due to the restaurant being poorly maintained. Chu Lian's gaze shifted from the signboard to the restaurant itself. It was close to noon, but the entrance of Guilin Restaurant was barren, devoid of any life except for a few small sparrows. No one was behind the counter either, but there was a short wooden stool next to it. A young man dressed in coarse fabric who looked about 15 or 16 was sitting on the stool. He was snoring in his sleep and drooling all over the counter. Seeing Guilin Restaurant in such a lazy state, Chu Lian furrowed her brows together. Wenqing was so angry that her expression turned grave. Chu Lian stepped forward and entered Guilin Restaurant. The sleeping young man didn't wake up, not even when she walked right up to him. Wenqing moved up and pushed him. The young man tilted over and finally woke up from his dreams with an abrupt start. "Who was it? Who pushed me?" Chapter 161 Incognito Visit to Guilin Restaurant, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Upon being woken from his nice nap, the young man raised his head and sent an angry glare to the people around him. When he noticed that it was an extremely young-looking madam with a couple of equally young maidservants, his expression turned timid for a moment. However, once he took a closer look and realized that they weren't dressed very richly, he regained his bravado. The waiter stood up and tossed a sideways look at Wenqing before brushing off the non-existent dust on his clothes. "What are you doing? Didn't you see that I was sleeping?" Wenqing frowned and stuck her hands on her hips before ranting back. "What was I doing? Aren't you running a restaurant here? We're here to eat. What else could we be doing here?" The young man grimaced, baring his teeth. He sent a sideways glance towards Chu Lian and her maidservants as he said, "Sorry, our restaurant isn't open today. The manager isn't around. Find somewhere else to eat at." "Ah, not open." Wenqing sniffed the air and could clearly smell something cooking in the kitchen at the back of the restaurant. Their doors were wide open too. How could the restaurant be closed? Chu Lian stood to one side and remained silent. Her bright eyes looked over the waiter, and then inspected the main hall behind him. Wenqing secretly observed Chu Lian's expression. Seeing as her mistress had no other orders, she continued with her own line of questioning. "What kind of business are you running here? Your doors are wide open, but you're chasing customers away. If you don't want to run this business, Then why leave the entrance open? Just close your doors and restaurant altogether. The waiter was infuriated by Wenqing's words. He was the nephew of the manager here. Because of that connection, those working in Guilin restaurant all gave way to him. He had never suffered the brunt of a young girl's temper before, not like he was now. Thus, his temper flared up. Who are you to be criticizing the way we do business? Go and find out who owns this business, then you'll know better than to stick your nose where it doesn't belong. Scram. The young waiter was not only treating his customers with disrespect, but even throwing an even bigger tantrum back at them. Chu Lian wandered into the main hall without bothering to deal with him, one corner of her lips curled up in amusement. The noise in the main hall had drawn the attention of the people further inside the restaurant. A moment later, a middle-aged voice resounded from the back, "It's almost time to eat." "RCAI, who are you talking to outside?" Chu Lian heard the voice first before she saw someone push aside the curtains leading to the back, revealing a middle-aged woman wearing a flowery indigo dress. The middle-aged woman had a long face and was slightly plump. Her eyes were so small that, when she smiled, they formed a single line. When she reached the main hall and spotted Chu Lian and her servant standing there, the middle-aged woman showed an expression of surprise. She stepped forward and put on a friendly smile. "May I ask what business this madam has with us?" Wenqing almost laughed despite her anger. This was a restaurant. Why would anyone ask their customers what they were here for? Was this woman trying to make a joke? Chu Lian was too lazy to speak. She shot a look at Wenqing. Understanding her mistress' order, Wenqing turned around and walked 2 steps towards the entrance, pointing her slender finger at the signboard above their heads. "Isn't Guilin Restaurant written up there? You have the word restaurant written so boldly on the banners next to the door, too. Our madam is here to have a meal. Don't tell me that's not possible." The middle-aged woman felt embarrassed after getting talked to by Wenqing. She wanted to reject these guests, since they hadn't bought much from the West Market today. They had only prepared enough for the restaurant staff to eat. However, the few sturdy-looking manservants caught her attention. When she saw them respectfully bow to Chu Lian as they made their reports, her words caught in her throat. She pulled out another smile and politely said, "Our restaurant has been remiss in welcoming our guests. Our CAI just started working here not long ago and is not familiar with the rules. Please forgive him, madam. Please, come in." Chapter 162, Incognito Visit to Guilin Restaurant, 3. Chu Lian followed the woman to a table in the main hall. When she looked down at the table, she realized that there was a layer of dust on it. Wenqing quickly used a handkerchief to wipe away the dust before supporting Chu Lian as she sat down. RCAI had followed behind the middle-aged woman, and was currently sporting an extremely unwilling expression on that ordinary face of his. If the woman hadn't tugged his arm once, he probably would have thrown another tantrum. Wenqing noticed that there was dust on the teacups on the table as well. Seeing as there was dust everywhere, she didn't bother spending the effort to clean anymore. She stood behind Chu Lian and asked, "I've heard that your restaurant has been open for quite a number of years. Our madam loves to eat good food. What signature dishes does your restaurant have to offer?" The middle-aged woman choked on the answer. Guilin Restaurant hadn't been doing business for quite a few months already. The cooks here had quit long ago. How could they possibly have any signature dishes to serve? The woman thought for a bit before replying, "This young lady must be very knowledgeable. Our restaurant has indeed been open for many years. We have a few signature dishes, of course. Otherwise, how else could we have remained here for so long?" Wenqing inwardly snorted, but didn't show a speck of her disdain on her face. She still remembered Chu Lian's orders back in the carriage. "Oh, since you have some signature dishes, then list out their names for our madam. Our madam has eaten dishes from all over this country, and she's had her fair share of delicacies." The woman hadn't expected Wenqing to be so thorough with her questioning. Her expression instantly stiffened. There weren't any cooks at all in Guilin Restaurant right now. How could they possibly know the names of the commonly served special dishes? Seeing that our CAI wanted to step up and throw the guests out, the woman grabbed his arm and tried to discreetly hold him back. Her eyes darted about the room as she tried to come up with a solution, but upon seeing none, She quickly tossed out another smile and said, "Young madam, I'm afraid I'm too uneducated and don't know the proper names for all those fancy dishes. Why don't I go back to the kitchen, get one of the cooks, and have them make some for you to see instead? What kind of restaurant wouldn't know the names of their signature dishes?" Was this woman taking them for fools? Wenqing harumphed. She was about to expose the trickery of this sly woman when Chu Lian sent her a reassuring look. The maidservant bit her lip and waved her hand at the woman. "Then hurry up and get the cooks to make the meal then. Our madam wants one portion of every signature dish you have. Remember to make it quick." "Certainly. Please wait for a moment, madam." After saying so, the woman turned and glared at our CAI. She lowered her voice and said, "Our CAI, come with me to the back to prepare some tea for our guests." Finally, she dragged away the unwilling RCAI. It was only after Wenqing had confirmed that the woman and the waiter were no longer within hearing range that she asked, "Third young madam, Guilin restaurant is clearly no longer doing business. Why did you have me place an order for food anyway?" Chu Lian winked mischievously at Wenqing. "I want to see what kind of tricks they'll try to pull." Wenqing scratched her head speechlessly. Chapter 163 Incognito Visit to Guilin Restaurant 4. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. The middle-aged woman was our CAI's eldest aunt from his father's side of the family. Her name was Wang Lu, or as most people called her, Mrs. Wang. The entire Wang family of servants had been part of matriarch his dowry back when she had married into the He family. Later on, they had been sent to manage Guilin Restaurant. Ever since the West Market had been redrawn, Guilin Restaurant's business had taken a sharp turn for the worse. Their finances were perpetually stuck in the red, and had been for the past several years. When the original manager left, the Wang family had been put in charge. Matriarch He had known that Guilin Restaurant was bleeding money, but she hadn't shut it down due to her memories of it. She hadn't inquired about the management either, so she didn't know that the Wang family was running it in this manner. After entering the backyard, our CAI tugged at Mrs. Wang. "Eldest aunt, why are you keeping them? We can just kick them out. It looks like she's some minor official's wife. How could they possibly compare to House Jing'an's status?" Mrs. Wang glared at him. "All you know how to do is kick our customers out. How many customers have you chased out of our doors this month? Although we're helping House Jing'an manage this business, we haven't had a single bit of income for the past few months. It doesn't look good on the books at all. Furthermore, didn't you see those sturdy manservants that young madam brought? It won't be good if we get into trouble. Your uncle isn't back yet." Our CAI frowned. "Eldest aunt, you're just too timid. We all know that Guilin Restaurant hasn't changed owners yet because of matriarch He. As long as the matriarch is around, Guilin Restaurant will remain standing, and we can live an idle life here. What can a lowly noble's wife do to us? The moment she hears that we're backed by House Jing'an, she'll probably wet herself in fright." Mrs. Wang sighed. All right. Our CAI, eldest aunt knows about all that. No matter what, we have to deal with them first. I wonder which cave that vixen crawled out of. She must have seduced some minor official's son and brought out some manservants to show off. She even had the gall to claim that she's eaten the finest gourmet dishes across the entire country. She's probably never even had those confections that Cook Jew of House Jing'an makes. All right, that's enough. Just watch while I cook up some random dishes to satisfy her. When she's done eating, tack on some charges to the bill and buy back half a roast chicken at night for our dinner." When our CAI heard Mrs. Wang's instructions, he chuckled devilishly and said, "Whatever eldest aunt says." The two of them entered the kitchen and Mrs. Wang started cooking. She started with a dish that could be cooked quickly, so that they could buy some time for the rest of the dishes. Mrs. Wang took out a white porcelain plate and was about to pour a pot full of meat into it when our CAI noticed what she was doing. He quickly moved to stop her. "Eldest aunt, that's for us to eat. If you give that to those people, won't it be such a waste?" Our CAI liked to eat meat. He had nagged Mrs. Wang to cook up some meat for days before she agreed to cook this one pot. How could he bear to let it go to Chu Lian and her party? Mrs. Wang found his childish actions funny and glared at him, but didn't go through with serving up the meat in the end. She moved the meat back into the pot and looked around the kitchen. She then made up some dishes without much care and sent RCAI to deliver it to the main hall. After 15 minutes, the waiter RCAI returned to the main hall with some dishes in hand. He placed them on the table none too gently with loud thuds. RCAI then proudly lifted his chin and said, "Madam, look carefully. These are Guilin Restaurant's signature dishes." Chu Lian looked at the table before her with an unmoved expression. 2 dishes were filled with something so charred she couldn't tell what it was. Another dish to the side was filled with soup, with a pitiful amount of scattered cabbage leaves. The other dish had been broiled for so long that its color had changed and she couldn't even tell what it was made of. The 4 dishes looked completely inedible. Did these people think she was blind? Without waiting for Wenqing to speak for her, Chu Lian said in a flat tone, "Signature dishes? I'm afraid these were made to feed the pigs." After saying so, Chu Lian swept the 4 dishes to the floor without the slightest hint of hesitation. The tinkling sound of the porcelain dishes shattering on the limestone floor resounded in the main hall. Wenqing and Wenlan had also been frightened by Chu Lian's sudden action. However, when they looked at the ugly expression on that arrogant waiter RCAI, the maidservants were delighted. It was as if they had finally let go of the frustration plaguing their hearts. Their bodies felt light and free of burden. Chapter 164, Teaching a Lesson, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Right after witnessing that scene, RCAI's eyes turned bloodshot from anger. He was truly shocked. This young madam had remained calm and silent from the moment she had entered, and she had seemed to have a mild temperament. When they entered, she had let her glib-tongued servant speak. Furthermore, she seemed pretty young to boot. RCAI had subconsciously assumed that she was weak and easy to bully. He completely hadn't expected her to sweep all the dishes onto the floor when angered. This young madam had even said that their food was the food of pigs. However, before she and her entourage arrived, these dishes were originally meant to be consumed by none other than his family. His eldest aunt had simply served the food already being cooked. So, didn't this mean she was calling them all pigs? RCAI's face flushed with anger. He always had an explosive temper. Ever since his uncle made use of his connections to give him a job at Guilin Restaurant, RCAI had never faced any setbacks. How could he endure this terrible insult? He was shocked, speechless for a moment before his anger took over. RCAI's face warped, and he found the voice to shout, "Heh! Who the hell do you think you are, creating trouble at our Guilin Restaurant? Why don't you ask around and find out just who this Guilin Restaurant belongs to? Let me tell you, if you don't want this matter to blow up, pay up and get out." The commotion in the main hall had finally managed to alert Mrs. Wang, who was all the way in the backyard. She hurriedly rushed out. When she saw the mess on the floor, her eyes widened in shock as well. She stuttered, What's going on?" RCAI turned to tell her, this arrogant madam was the one who tossed them to the floor. What? Chu Lian calmly glanced at RCAI. She couldn't care less about their conversation. She dusted off her hands and stood up. "What if I don't want to pay up and refuse to leave? What can you do to me?" RCAI hadn't expected Chu Lian to be so forceful. However, with House Jing'an backing them, she had to think again if she thought they were going to be easy to bully. Thus, he started getting aggressive too. "What can we do? I'll let you have a taste of what jail is like." Wenqing and Wenlan stood in front of Chu Lian with angry expressions, shielding her. Their bodies were tense. The moment Chu Lian gave the order, they would immediately take this boastful fellow down. Chu Lian sneered. So this trip wasn't a complete waste. She had seen clearly for herself what the state of affairs were like at Guilin Restaurant, so she didn't have to continue acting out this farce with these 2 servants. Chu Lian sent a commanding look towards the manservants behind her. Before RCAI and Mrs. Wang could throw up another fuss, the 2 of them were caught and tied up by the 2 burly manservants. In a rage, Mrs. Wang cried out, "How dare you tie us up? We're servants from House Jing'an. You can't tie us up." Chu Lian walked a circle around the two of them, then another for good measure. House Jing'an. I'm apprehending some bad servants on behalf of House Jing'an. You. How dare you? Aren't you scared that House Jing'an will hold you accountable for your crimes and punish you? Our CAI struggled and wriggled against his bonds. His eyes were now completely bloodshot from anger. However, since he was just a teenager, he couldn't possibly beat the manservants who practiced martial arts. His struggles bore no fruit, only succeeding to tighten the ropes around him further. You bitch. Just you wait. My uncle has already gone to report this to the officials. Wenqing was trying her best to hold back her laughter. If these two clowns before her realized who their master was, they would probably pee their pants in fright. Just as our CAI finished speaking, they could hear someone running in from outside Guilin restaurant's entrance. Following that, a panting middle-aged man entered the main hall. The man proudly pointed at the middle of the hall where Chu Lian's party stood, before turning back to say, "Sirs, these people are the ones who came to cause trouble in our restaurant. Please arrest them, quickly." Right after that, 5 bailiffs with tall figures and fierce expressions came striding into the hall. Each of them had a sword hung at their waists. One of the sturdy-looking bailiffs with a full, curly beard seemed to be their leader. He started roaring when he marched into the hall. Which one of you was so impudent as to commit a crime in broad daylight? Arrest them all. TL note: these bailiffs work for the criminal court. They patrol around their assigned districts and can arrest anyone who's doing something against the law. They are somewhat like a police force in ancient China, but they work directly for the criminal court. Bailiff is my own translation of the Chinese term, Yi, or literally yamen, criminal court, runners. I went with the British definition of the word, a sheriff's officer who executes writs and processes and carries out distraints and arrests. I'm trying to localize words where I can so it's easier to read, but at the same time, providing enough context like the original Chinese term. Let me know if any terms seem out of place, as my understanding of English might be different from yours. 3. Chapter 165, Teaching a Lesson, 2. When the bound RCAI and Mrs. Wang saw that the head of their family had come, they shouted for help. 2 of the bailiffs came up to arrest Chu Lian and her servants, but 2 of House Jing'an's manservants blocked them while Wenqing and Wenlan hid Chu Lian behind them. Chu Lian wasn't even the slightest bit anxious, even in this situation. Conversely, she felt that this Wang family was being too theatrical. She didn't retreat like they expected. Instead, she stepped forward, chin slightly raised as she looked straight at the leader of the bailiffs with a serious gaze. Dear sir, do think carefully on who you're going to arrest today. If you arrest the wrong person, it won't be good for you. The bearded leader was stunned by Chu Lian's words. He visibly hesitated for a moment. He was just a normal bailiff on patrol on Anli Lane, where most of the population were common citizens. However, in this capital, you could find officials almost anywhere. If you threw a rock, there was a high chance that it might land on some prince or noble. He had managed to eke out a peaceful living with this career thus far due to his caution in dealing with people and making sure not to offend the wrong person. He knew that Guilin restaurant was owned by House Jing'an. Although they were considered a noble house, in this huge capital, they stood somewhere in the middle of the rankings. There were still a bunch of imperial family members and important officials above them. The head bailiff debated with himself for a little longer. While their leader was hesitating, the other bailiffs paused their actions as well. Manager Wang got anxious upon seeing this. Sirs, look at how those people are dressed. They don't look like nobles at all. They are just trying to deceive us all. Don't listen to them. When the leader took a closer look at how Chu Lian's party was dressed, he frowned. As Manager Wang had said, they were only dressed like slightly richer common folk. Chu Lian knew that the bailiff's thoughts had started going in the wrong direction, but she was too lazy to continue this farce further. She looked at Wenqing, and the maidservant quickly moved forward. The bailiff before her tried to stop her, but Wenqing casually leaped up and swept the 2 bailiffs to the floor in just 2 kicks. The bailiffs groaned in pain and couldn't get up. She walked up to the head bailiff and extended the jade token in her hands to the bailiff. When the bearded bailiff saw the jade token, His legs turned to jelly and he almost collapsed to the ground. Imperial family. Wenqing harumphed and kept the jade token before returning back to Chu Lian's side. She then spoke loudly to the bearded bailiff. Do you understand who you're trying to arrest now? The bearded bailiff immediately knelt down in fear and anxiety. This humble one has startled Honored One. This humble one deserves to die. The other bailiffs had also recognized the jade token that Wenqing took out. Even Manager Wang managed to get a good look at it. The moment he laid his eyes on that token, Manager Wang felt as if he was about to collapse. His expression was full of utter shock. He hadn't expected this ordinary young madam to have brought out a jade token that only the imperial family was supposed to have. In the Great Wu dynasty, the Ministry of Internal Affairs would issue a jade token to anyone with a noble title. Although the jade tokens had different carvings on them, the quality was the same, and it was a mark of the imperial family. The token that Chu Lian had given to Wenqing to show had been delivered together with the imperial decree. She hadn't thought that it would come in handy so soon. Once the bearded bailiff came back to his senses, the one to be arrested turned into Manager Wang. Manager Wang didn't dare to say a single word. Even House Jinggan was ranked lower than the imperial family. The shouting Mrs. Wang and RCAI had also deflated like balloons. Their heads were down and they kept as quiet as a mouse. Chapter 166, Teaching a Lesson, 3. Upon recalling the insults he had thrown at Chu Lian earlier, RCAI started to tremble. The face that had been full of fighting spirit earlier was now completely ashen pale in fear. Two bailiffs took the bound Mrs. Wang and RCAI off the hands of the manservants. Suddenly, a puddle appeared on the cyan floor tiles, followed by a terrible fishy stink. When Wenqing looked down, she realized that the crotch of our case pants were soaked. He had actually peed himself in fright. When Manager Wang saw our case state, shame flooded his being. He glared at our CAI angrily. This was all that idiot's fault. Manager Wang had just gone to the gambling dens and lost some money. Afraid that Mrs. Wang would find out, he had entered sneakily through the back door and bumped into our CAI when he was bringing out the dishes to the main hall. Our CAI had cooked up this plan to get Manager Wang to bring over some bailiffs they were familiar with to scare Chu Lian and have her cough up more money. Who would have thought that they would shoot themselves in their own foot? Of course Manager Wang was filled with hatred. The bearded bailiff came over to Chu Lian eagerly and bowed at the waist. Does Honored One have any other orders? Chu Lian didn't bother speaking with the leader. Instead, she turned to Wenqing and said, "Bring me the account books from the counter." Despite feeling the embarrassment of getting ignored, the bailiff didn't dare to voice any complaints. The gap in their statuses was too great. Furthermore, judging by the ability that the maidservant had showed just now, he didn't dare to underestimate them. Even if this young madam hadn't shown off her imperial identity, the five of them wouldn't have been a match for that one maidservant. When he thought of that, the curly-bearded leader appeared even more respectful and humble. Manager Wang startled when he heard Chu Lian's command. What? The accounts? Someone who was affiliated with the imperial family actually wanted to see the accounts of his little restaurant. There had to be something wrong with that, or he had misheard. Manager Wang gulped in fright. Somehow, he managed to say a few words. Honored One, what's there to see in our little restaurant's books? They are merely a bunch of insignificant numbers. Please do not tire yourself. Chu Lian looked down at Manager Wang. Manager Wang, I forgot to mention this to you. Guilin Restaurant has been given to me by my grandmother. This place will not require your services any longer. It was like Manager Wang had been struck by lightning. The shock factor from this simple sentence of Chu Lian's was worlds above the time she brought out the jade token carrying the insignia of the imperial family. Manager Wang's eyes looked like they were going to pop out of his head. Chu Lian's words echoed in his mind, and when he finally processed what they meant, he immediately knew her true identity. A young madam from House Jinggan? Who else could she be other than the third young madam, the most recent addition to the Jinggan household? Furthermore, this third young madam had only just received a personal title of Honored Lady 2 days ago, conferred to her by the Emperor. They had just tried to bully their own masters. Had this young madam simply been a member of the imperial family, then their punishment for offending her would have only been spending a few nights in a jail cell. With their connection to House Jingan, they wouldn't have even experienced any hardship. However, things were totally different now. Third young madam was not only a member of the imperial family, but she was also a member of House Jingan. For mere servants of House Jingan, like them, third young madam's words were law. To make matters worse, she was also the new master of Guilin Restaurant. Even if she wanted their lives taken, all she had to do was say the word. A moment after, a wet patch appeared under Manager Wang's crotch as well. The apple didn't fall far from the tree. Both uncle and nephew had peed their pants. What an impressive ability. Chapter 167, Disbelief, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volaronovels. Please read from the original source. The bearded bailiff's eyes darted about as he thought. Although the capital was large, there was a great number of people occupying the space. As long as someone intentionally tried to spread some news, even the most boring gossip would spread like wildfire. The house of Count Jingen was also a noble house. When ordinary folk had nothing better to do, they enjoyed discussing interesting tidbits like the private affairs of the noble houses during their meals. A few days ago, when Chu Lian had received an imperial edict and been conferred the title of Honored Lady Genie, House Jingen hadn't hidden the news at all. Chu Lian usually stayed inside the Jingen estate without paying attention to what went on outside, so she had no idea that this matter had already spread throughout the capital. Although there were many members of the imperial family who were conferred titles, House Jingen's third young madam was the first non-imperial family member to receive a personal title in decades, so it was normal for everyone to be surprised. In fact, there were also plenty of noble ladies who were looking for an opportunity to meet this honored Lady Genie as well. Due to a mere fifth-ranked honored lady title, Chu Lian had been pushed to the height of gossip. She had practically become famous overnight among the capital's people. These bailiffs weren't stupid. The leader immediately realized what Chu Lian's identity was. He glared at Manager Wang, wishing he could split that man's head open. What the hell? And he even called himself a servant of the Jingen estate. If he couldn't even recognize his own master, he deserved whatever punishment came to him. The leader's attitude became even more deferential. He even seemed to be trying to curry favor with the flattering lilt of his tone. Honored one, please let this humble one deal with these bad servants who don't know any better for you, so they don't spoil your mood. Chu Lian's brows furrowed together. She really didn't like how this head bailiff had changed his attitude towards her so quickly, like he was merely flipping the pages of a book. She indifferently said, "There's no need for that. I'll send someone to bring them back to the estate, and have the steward personally punish them." No matter how terrible this Wang family's actions had been, they were owned by the matriarch. It wouldn't be proper to use her title and order the bailiffs to deal with them. Certain things should stay within the family, especially as the matriarch was her elder. The leader was rather embarrassed by the rejection, but he had no choice but to keep quiet. When they heard what Chu Lian had said, the three servants were all scared out of their wits and knelt on the floor, begging for forgiveness. Chu Lian didn't want to deal with this annoying family, so she ordered the manservants who had come along with her to stuff their mouths and send them to the steward of the estate. Wenqing politely sent the bailiffs off. Guilin Restaurant's main hall finally settled into silence again. Only Chu Lian and her party were left. It was at this moment that she heard footsteps coming the back. Chu Lian raised her brows. She hadn't thought that there were still other people inside Guilin Restaurant. The curtains in front of the door shifted, revealing a white-haired old man dressed in a rough tunic. When the old man lifted his gaze, he was met with Chu Lian's appraising eyes. He was slightly stunned, but immediately followed with an amiable smile. "May this old servant ask if you're the master of this place?" Wenqing and Wenlan exchanged glances, both wearing identically puzzled expressions on their faces. Wenqing walked up to him and supported him as they walked over to Chu Lian. "Old sir, this is House Jingen's third young madam. The matriarch has already handed over this restaurant to third young madam." The old man's eyes immediately lit up, causing his wrinkled face to look like peels of dried tangerines. "There's finally hope for Guilin Restaurant. It can be saved. The old man began to laugh and cry with joy. He used his sleeves to wipe away his tears. Chu Lian was confused. "Old sir, may I ask your identity?" The old man quickly calmed himself down and said, "My apologies, third young madam, this old servant has been inconsiderate. I am the bookkeeper of Guilin Restaurant." The old man's surname was also Wang, but he wasn't related to manager Wang and his family at all. However, the old man was also a servant originally from the Jing'an estate. TL note: a bookkeeper takes care of the account books. Chu Lian and Wenqing are literally calling him old man, but using a very polite term in Chinese. It's used in deference to his greater life experience and knowledge. To give the same context, I tried using old sir to show that they are giving him respect due to his age. 3. Chapter 168, Disbelief. 2. 20 years ago, the old man had been sent to Guilin Restaurant to be a bookkeeper. He had toiled away, doing enough careful and conscientious work for a lifetime. Although he should have retired back to the Jing'an estate at such an age, when he saw how Guilin Restaurant's business was failing in the hands of the Wang family, he couldn't bear to just leave. The old count had saved bookkeeper Wang a long time ago, when bookkeeper Wang had been a wounded soldier. Due to his age, he hadn't tried to look for a wife after recuperating from his injuries, so he didn't have any relatives back at the estate. He hadn't been able to contend against the Wang family in his circumstances either, so he could only continue to bide his time in Guilin Restaurant. "Please wait here, third young madam." Bookkeeper Wang walked to the back of the restaurant and soon returned with a small wooden box. He held up the box with 2 hands and passed it to Chu Lian. "Third young madam, these are the accounts that this old servant has been privately keeping. Please have a look." It turned out that manager Wang had stopped letting bookkeeper Wang handle the accounts for quite some time already. The books that he handed over to the family were merely forged. Since bookkeeper Wang couldn't do anything about that, he had secretly made his own copies while waiting for the day that he could hand it to his masters. Chu Lian hadn't expected this old man to have done this. Although she knew inside that the accounts he had kept were practically useless to her now, she still received it with gratitude. The fruits of someone's hard work, whether small or large, sweet or sour, should be received with the importance and respect they deserve. "Thank you for your hard work, Mr. Bookkeeper." Chu Lian sincerely thanked him. Manager Wang smiled so widely that his eyes turned into slits. "Don't say that, third young madam, it is this old servant's duty." Following that, bookkeeper Wang showed her around Guilin Restaurant. There was a woman over 40 who did chores for the restaurant in the backyard. Bookkeeper Wang had been able to stay safe and sound all this time because she had taken care of him throughout the time of the Wang family's exploitation. Chu Lian stood in the backyard, examining the layout of the whole building. Although Guilin Restaurant wasn't very eye-catching from the outside and couldn't be compared to the majestic restaurants on Jukyu Avenue, it had its own charms. Guilin Restaurant's layout was like a gourd. It had a small entrance, but the area inside was huge. The backyard even had 2 sections, which made up for the lack of a second floor. The buildings on either side of Guilin Restaurant were both ordinary homes. According to bookkeeper Wang, ever since the West Market had been shifted, the properties on Anli Lane had lost their value. In fact, one of the neighboring properties had been empty all this time, and nobody was staying there. Bookkeeper Wang led Chu Lian into the second section of the backyard and explained, "Initially, this courtyard was meant for guests, but ever since the business took a dive, the Wang family took it over for themselves." Chu Lian entered the courtyard and noted the elaborate design. There was some mottled bamboo planted in a corner with a small decorative mountain beside it. Beside the mountain were some stone tables and stools. On the other side, there was a small cluster of banana trees. The corridor leading up to the main building in this courtyard was covered in wisterias. Interestingly, on the side of the building facing the banana trees, there was a small music room for playing the zither. Although there were no longer any zithers or incense burners in it and it had long been filled up with junk, Chu Lian could still imagine what Guilin Restaurant looked like decades ago. This losing business had completely exceeded Chu Lian's expectations. Chu Lian chatted with the old bookkeeper for an hour or so before taking the wooden box full of account books with her and leaving in the carriage. Chapter 169, Disbelief, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Bookkeeper Wang and the middle-aged woman who did chores escorted Chu Lian all the way to the entrance of the alley. The white-haired bookkeeper Wang kept watching the carriage as it left and entered the bustling main street. He finally heaved a sigh of relief, but his clouded old eyes didn't seem to hold much hope. He turned around and used a cane for support as he hobbled back to Guilin Restaurant. The middle-aged woman who was supporting him on his other side heard a soft, unmistakable sigh from him. She didn't understand why he was sighing and asked, "Mr. Wang, the estate has sent third young madam here to fix the restaurant. Shouldn't you be happy?" The old bookkeeper paused and looked around them. He gave a bitter smile. In a place like this, how could we possibly regain our former glory? Actually, the old bookkeeper didn't believe that Guilin Restaurant could return to its glory days. He was experienced enough to determine this after living so many years and working as a bookkeeper in Guilin Restaurant for 20 years. He had lived through the ups and downs of this restaurant's life as well. The world was ever-changing. It wasn't as if the Wang family was the only reason that the restaurant hadn't been doing well. All of the famous tea houses, restaurants, silversmiths, and goldsmiths in the capital were located in bustling, lively districts. There was an old saying that fit this situation: a dead district is a dead business. Restaurants needed a constant flow of people to survive. The middle-aged woman couldn't quite understand the bookkeeper's meaning. She thought rather simply. In her eyes, as long as their master had money, anything could be done. Was there anything that couldn't be done with money? "Old sir, aren't you thinking too negatively? See, since third young madam came today, she already threw out the Wang family." That was a delight. It was clear that this middle-aged servant had also suffered torment under the Wang family. "Mrs. Li, how could you possibly understand? Just wait and see." The old bookkeeper didn't bother trying to explain further. He slowly walked back to Guilin Restaurant. Honestly speaking, third young madam was just a young girl who had just come of age. Even if she had been raised well with the bearing and talents of a noble lady, it wasn't an easy task to revive a failing restaurant, especially in a residential district like this one. Even if she had a noble title backing her, reviving this old restaurant still wasn't going to be easy. Back in the carriage, Chu Lian didn't know that the old bookkeeper didn't have a shred of confidence in her. She was peeking out from the curtains of the carriage to look outside from time to time. It hadn't been easy for her to come out alone today. Wouldn't it be such a waste if she didn't go out for some shopping before returning home? Wenqing and Wenlan had also noticed Chu Lian's interest. They exchanged smiles. Wenqing said, "Third young madam, this servant can act as your guide, if you wish." Chu Lian turned to look at Wenqing, her eyes wide with surprise. "You're familiar with this place?" Wenlan pressed her lips together to hide her smile. She was a little more introverted than Wenqing and usually spoke less. If she could avoid it, she would rather not speak. Whenever she was with Wenqing, it was always Wenqing who would speak for them. "Third young madam, this servant and Wenqing both grew up in the streets of the capital. It was only in the past 2 years that we lived with senior servant Zhong on an estate. However, we came out to buy things quite often, so we're very familiar with the capital." Chu Lian blinked. Her eyes lit up in pleasant surprise. Wow. So they were like living maps. "Tell me about the capital, quickly." Although the original Chu Lian had also lived in the capital since birth, she was the legitimate daughter of a noble house, so she rarely left her estate. How could she be familiar with the common roads and markets like Wenqing? In the gentle shaking of the carriage, Wenqing smiled as she explained the lay of the land to Chu Lian. "Third young madam, we're about to leave the boundaries of Changping Lane. After we pass this small street, Pingkang Lane will be in front of us. To the left of Pingkang Lane was the East Market, while Shenyang Lane was to its south. To the north was Chunming Avenue, where most of the important officials stayed. This included the visiting officials normally stationed in other parts of the country, as well as some of the up-and-coming scholar candidates. For example, Lord Yang's official residence was located in Pingkang Lane." Chu Lian lifted the curtain and curiously peeked outside. Suddenly, a figure cut into her line of sight. Chapter 170, Something Fishy, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Although she had only met that person once before, Chu Lian knew she would never forget his face. Back when she had returned to her maiden family for a visit, Chu Lian had served him tea together with He Changdi as a rite of respect. His attitude had been cool and indifferent as he received the cup of tea and returned to them a red envelope, just as if he were merely conducting some routine business transaction. Then, when she had been led away by the womenfolk of the family, he hadn't given a single word of advice to her, his own daughter. She didn't know if the biological father of her current body was happy with his new son-in-law, He Changdi, or whether or not they had bonded together over some wine. Chu Chijing was dressed in an elaborately embroidered grey brocade robe. He stood before the entrance to an estate with some manservants by his side. He was pacing back and forth, seemingly anxious and impatient. In actual fact, this second master of House Yingguo wasn't considered that old. He was only 35. He didn't keep a beard or moustache, and he had a jade crown on his head. Coupled with his slender figure, he looked about 6 or 7 years younger than his actual age. Chu Lian's almond-shaped eyes slightly narrowed. She looked up at the signboard above the residence he was standing in front of, which read Pan Estate. As she watched, a servant who had been guarding the doors quickly ran into the estate. Shortly after, 2 strongly built retainers carrying swords came out together with the servant who had gone in. The servant pointed in the direction of Chu Chijing and his party. The 2 retainers strode over to Chu Chijing in a few steps. One of the retainers pushed Chu Chijing forcefully. If not for Chu Chijing's personal manservant reacting quickly and catching him, he might have been completely pushed onto the ground and lost all his face. Immediately after that, Chu Chijing's expression contorted and he started arguing with the retainers. His personal manservants could tell that the Pan Estate's retainers had some martial arts skill, so they shielded Chu Chijing behind them. The 2 retainers were annoyed by Chu Chijing's scolding. Their rage showed clearly on their faces and their hands shifted towards the swords they carried at their waists, as if they might draw them at any moment. Chu Lian knocked on the carriage wall and ordered the driver to slow down a little. She lifted the curtain a little and continued watching the entrance of the Pan Estate, but she did nothing else. She wasn't the original Chu Lian, after all. Upon receiving such cold treatment from this father of hers during the tea ceremony, she already understood that she wasn't loved by him. Chu Lian didn't care much for that. She was someone who would give as much as she got. Since Chu Chijing didn't care for her, she wouldn't bother going out of her way for him. Wasn't it more fun to simply sit back and watch the drama? When Wenqing noticed third young madam's instructions to the driver, she peeked out of the window as well. When she noticed the signboard on top of the estate's entrance, she gasped quietly and exclaimed, "The Pan Estate." Wenlan saw that Chu Lian seemed to be intently watching the show, so she secretly pushed Wenqing a little. Wenqing quickly covered her mouth, and her eyes blinked in apology. Chu Lian didn't have the mood to care about what Wenqing had been surprised about. Her eyes were fixed on the drama unfolding in front of the Pan Estate's entrance. Just as the 2 retainers were about to use force, a carriage came out from the alley next to the Pan Estate's entrance. The carriage quickly stopped in front of the entrance. The manservant guarding the doors ran to the carriage and eagerly lifted the curtain doors before helping a white-haired, bearded old man who looked to be about 50 or 60 off the carriage. At this distance, Chu Lian couldn't hear what they were saying at all. The white-haired man was about to enter the estate immediately, but he seemed to have heard something that Chu Chijing had shouted while being restrained by the retainers. He abruptly turned around and sent a shocked and dangerous-looking gaze towards Chu Chijing. The bearded old man stopped outside the Pan Estate's mahogany doors with his hands behind his back and looked at Chu Chijing, as if trying to bore a hole through him with his gaze alone. Time seemed to slow from the intensity of this man's gaze. Finally, the man waved away the 2 retainers. Chu Chijing's originally nervous expression finally relaxed, he even seemed to be a little pleased with himself. A hint of evil shone in his eyes. Chu Chijing forcefully pushed away the 2 retainers who had been holding him back. After doing so, he seemed to feel relieved of his frustration from before. He even kicked at them twice. After releasing his previous frustration, Chu Chijing smoothed out his clothing, which had turned to disarray from the scuffle. He placed his hands behind his back and strode into the Pan estate with his manservants. It wasn't until Chu Chizheng's figure had disappeared past the first wall of the Pan estate that Chu Lian let down the curtain. A few expressions flitted across her face. Her original desire to go shopping in the capital had been completely erased by witnessing this strange incident. Chu Lian lowered her head in thought. Wenqing and Wenlan didn't dare to disturb her, so they sat in silence by her side. After a long moment, Chu Lian finally lifted her head and turned to Wenqing. Wenqing, which official in the capital occupies the Pan estate? She remembered that Wenqing had gasped in surprise just now, so the owner of the Pan estate must be someone important in the ranks of the court. Wenqing replied honestly, "Third young madam, the Pan estate of Pingkang Lane is owned by Pan Gulao." At the moment, there were 5 ministers in the cabinet. Amongst these 5, they were also ranked differently. This Pan Gulao was the man who had the highest status amongst the cabinet. He was only 1 rank below the imperial scribe, a real first-ranked official. Chu Lian didn't care much about the court matters of the Great Wu dynasty. In the portion of the original novel that she had read, there was no mention of this high and mighty Lord Pan, so she wouldn't know anything about him. Chu Lian nodded. "I understand now." Chapter 171, Something Fishy, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Although Wenqing seemed to be curious about the identity of the middle-aged man third young madam had been staring at, since third young madam didn't seem to want to speak about it, she held back her questions. The servants who had accompanied her today were all from House Jingen, so none of them had recognized Chu Chizheng as her father. When Chu Lian heard Wenqing's reply, she slipped back into deep thought. Judging by that situation just now, Lord Pan hadn't wanted to see her father at all. What changed his mind was something that her father had said at the last minute. Back then, Lord Pan's expression had looked very complicated, with a bunch of emotions all mixed together. It could send shivers down anyone's spine. In the slowly declining House Yingguo, Chu Chizheng wasn't the eldest son, nor someone who was very smart. He clung on to the protection of his family to survive. Up until now, he hadn't managed to get even a low-ranked slack official position in court. He was essentially useless. This kind of noble would normally keep meeting the same small number of friends to pass the time. They wouldn't interact with officials who held actual power in court. Lord Pan hadn't even glanced at Chu Chizheng when he first arrived at the estate. However, after Chu Chizheng said something, Lord Pan had not only looked at him, he had even invited him into his estate. It was clear that they were going to be discussing something related to business. Could her father have found something to use against Lord Pan? But Chu Lian found this thought too ridiculous. She shook her head and snorted. How could that be possible? How could someone in a high position of power like Lord Pan be an average person? Those with power had to have the charisma, ambition, and cunning to get them there in the first place. Even if Lord Pan didn't have all of those traits, he likely had 1 or 2 at the very least. The very notion that an idle noble like her father, who played around all day, could somehow outplay Lord Pan, who held actual authority in his hands, was laughable. Even the thought of Chu Chizheng holding some sort of weakness of Lord Pan's was absurd. Perhaps not even a child would believe that. Furthermore, House Yingguo had never been connected with the Pan estate. The 2 men had probably never even met before, so the chances of such a thing decreased even further. Chu Lian frowned and tried to recall the events of the book. However, she couldn't think of any details relevant to the current situation as it was now. In the end, she could only give up. She would cross that bridge when she came to it. Even if her father was plotting something, it was none of her business now. Married daughters were like water. Once thrown out, they were no longer connected to their original family. She was now a member of House Jingen as He Sanlang's wife. After reassuring herself, Chu Lian finally relaxed. When Wenqing saw that Chu Lian's expression had relaxed, she spoke up and asked, "Third young madam, would you still like to shop around?" By this time, they had already left Pingkang Lane and were driving along Zhuqiu Avenue. Chu Lian had already lost her initial anticipation after witnessing that scene. She was about to order them to return home directly, but she suddenly remembered that it would be Countess Jingen's birthday in a few days. She didn't have a suitable gift for her mother-in-law yet. Thus, she held back her words. Let's look for a few stores to shop in. Mother's birthday is coming. Although she didn't have to buy something extremely valuable for her mother-in-law's birthday and Countess Jingen wasn't one to mind, the entire estate knew that she had received a nice sum of money from Imperial concubine Wei, thanks to Imperial Princess Leiao's golden cheline. When she had been given the title of Honored Lady, she had also received an award of 100 gold taels. If she didn't spend a good amount of money on Countess Jingen's gift, she might draw the gossip of certain jealous people. Chu Lian inwardly sighed. That sister-in-law of hers, Madame Zhu, was waiting for her to make a mistake. How could she let Madame Zhu have any chance of reprimanding her or punishing her? It didn't matter what gift she picked this time. It just had to be suitably expensive. She could have claimed that she didn't have any money in the past, but she couldn't do that now. Chu Lian pouted, feeling a little angry inside. It was just 2 measly awards, but the people around her were already jealous. How annoying. She was better off hiding whatever money she made in the future. Her husband wasn't by her side, so there was a real chance that someone else might try to take the money from her using all sorts of reasons. Wenqing lifted up the curtains a little and pointed at the stores on both sides of Zhuqiu Avenue. She introduced them to Chu Lian one by one. Third young madam, that's Hengxing Medicine Hall, Luohe Calligraphy, Lanqiao Clothing, and oh, that one over there is Jinsha Pavilion. These are all famous stores in the capital. Many high-ranked nobles and young ladies like to shop here. Chu Lian nodded. Since she hadn't thought of what she wanted to buy, she decided to look around each of them. Wenqing told the driver to stop and she helped Chu Lian off the carriage together with Wenlan. There were many people walking on Zhuqiu Avenue. Some richly dressed men and women would also pass by from time to time. Chu Lian looked around her. Her impression of the Great Wu dynasty increased a notch. This dynasty wasn't as restrictive towards the freedom of its women, unlike the old Song and Ming dynasties. The openness of this dynasty seemed more like the early Tang. Most of the ladies out here didn't even cover their heads while they were out. There were even women studying at the capital's Imperial College. It was normal for noble ladies to be out shopping as well. Chu Lian entered Hengxing Medicine Hall first. For the sake of her incognito visit today, she had dressed plainly. Her clothes were made of ordinary fabric. With 2 young maids like Wenqing and Wenlan by her side, she looked like the newlywed wife of a minor official. When she entered the medicine hall, none of the staff came up to greet her. Chu Lian didn't mind this at all. She slowly looked around the store with Wenqing and Wenlan. TL note, if you didn't check out the announcement post for this chapter, please read it here. TMR's author sent a message specially for the readers of the English translation, so I'm collecting messages from all of us to send to her. The message and link is in the announcement post. Chapter 172, Digging a Hole for Herself. 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had taken a class on traditional Chinese medicine back when she was in university, so she could recognize a few types of herbs. She wasn't too good at it until she read a few wilderness survival books later on and became somewhat familiar with the basics. Now that she was browsing through a medicine hall, she understood quite a bit. Chu Lian even picked up 1 or 2 types of herbs and took a sniff to check their quality, but that was the limit of her abilities. Right across the street from Hengxing Medicine Hall was the most famous jewelry store in the capital, Jinsha Pavilion. At this moment, there were a few young ladies standing at a counter in Jinsha Pavilion, chattering away. Their eyes were lit up with excitement as they looked at the accessories a female manager was showing to them, probably so they could try them on. These ladies weren't strangers to Chu Lian, they were a few legitimate daughters of House Ying. They had originally come out with 2 of their older brothers escorting them, but when they had reached Jinsha Pavilion, the 2 young masters had found excuses to leave, not wanting to accompany their sisters to jewelry shop. Now, only the young girls were left in the store, discussing their accessories happily. 5th Miss Su took a liking to a lustrous, transparent green jade bangle. Although the quality of the jade wasn't the best, it won in its vibrant color. Its hue alternated between green and blue, like the image of a flowing river. During this hot summer, it was especially cool and refreshing. When worn on her slender, fair wrist, it brought out the color of her skin. She couldn't resist asking the female manager, "Manager, how much is this bangle?" The manager smiled and replied, "This jade bangle does match your fair and slender wrist very well, miss. What a good eye you have." As she said so, she brought out an exquisite wooden box from under the counter and opened it. There was a matching pair of jade earrings in the box, shaped like teardrops and extremely beautiful. "Miss, if these earrings are to your liking, why don't you have these earrings for free together with the bangle? Then this madam will simply accept 50 taels for it. What do you think?" 50 taels. Although that wasn't considered much, it was a little expensive for young noble ladies like them, who only received a small monthly allowance. The legitimate daughters of House Ying only received 8 taels of silver for their monthly allowance. A single jade bangle from Jinsha Pavilion actually cost half a year's worth of their allowance. Miss Su had brought 60 taels out today, but those 60 taels were the result of half a year's worth of saving. It was still too much for her to hand them all over for a single bangle. She was still thinking of buying another set of accessories for her mother. The corners of Miss Su's lips tugged downwards and she set down the bangle. Her eyes carried a trace of unwillingness as she said, "Manager, I'll look at something else." The manager seemed to notice her difficulty. However, she didn't say anything more. Without any change in expression, she brought out cheaper accessories for her to choose from. While holding a golden hairpin inlaid with jade and pearls, Miss Yuan chuckled, "Fifth sister, you've brought more than 50 taels out today. Are you so miserly that you can't even bear to buy a single jade bangle?" Eighth Miss Yuan's words made Miss Su flush. Miss Su pressed her lips together, but didn't say anything in reply. She lowered her head to look at the new set of ornaments, pretending she didn't hear anything. Miss Yuan chuckled again and passed the golden hairpin in her hands to the manager, boldly saying, "Manager, pack up this hairpin for me." The manager hadn't expected this young lady to be so generous. Her smile seeped into her eyes as she brought an exquisite box over to place the hairpin in. "This young lady has a good eye, too. This golden hairpin has 3 emeralds on it, each of them the same size. The style of the flowers on top of it is good, too, only 2 flowers, simple yet elegant. It matches perfectly with the pink dress you're wearing today, miss. This hairpin is the handiwork of our master Liu. This madam will set the price low at 150 taels, just for you, miss. TL note, Pest. Please submit your messages to TMR's author through this form instead of writing in the comment. https://goo. GL forms FC 7 kW 4 OKDY 6 IMU 2. Chapter 173, Digging a Hole for Herself, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. When the manager had been complimenting her, Miss Yuan had her nose so high in the air she was about to start floating away in pride. She had good taste, to have picked such a beautiful hairpin. It was so much better than that silly bangle that 5th Miss Su had picked. However, when she heard what the price was, Miss Yuan's expression froze in place. What? 150 taels? Why didn't the manager simply steal the money from her? It was just a golden hairpin. Miss Yuan had seen that this golden hairpin would definitely be more expensive than Miss Su's jade bangle, but she thought that it would cost 100 taels at maximum. She had begged for 100 taels from her mother so she could go shopping today, and in addition to that, she had also brought 30 or so taels from her own savings. Even a young lady of a first-ranked noble house would bring out only a little more than 100 taels at most. How could she, of the declining House Ying, take out even more than them? If they had been shopping at Jinsha Jewelry next door, the 130 taels she had brought would be more than enough. However, this was the high-class Jinsha pavilion that they were perusing. She had originally thought of showing up Miss Su and shaming her. In the Ying estate, it was only this unmarried 5th Miss who continued to be at loggerheads with her, the 8th Miss. She was going to make Miss Su eat dirt today in public so that she would fight her less in the future. However, she hadn't thought that she would be digging a hole for herself as well. She only carried 130-something taels on her right now. Miss Yuan's expression turned ugly. Due to her conflicting emotions and present embarrassment, her face went red, then white. She opened her mouth and met with the manager's eager gaze. Though she wanted to withdraw her previous claims, the words were stuck in her throat and wouldn't come out. Miss Yuan's panicked gaze darted around the shop. Her personal maidservant's expression was even uglier. She looked like she was about to cry from her anxiety. She even tugged at her master's sleeve carefully. If 8th Miss really bought a golden hairpin for 150 taels, 2nd Madam would surely scold her up and down. Most of the Madam's own accessories and ornaments cost less than 100 taels. 8th Miss would simply get a reprimand and a lecture, but as her personal maidservant, she could be dragged out of the estate and sold. 5th Miss and 9th Miss weren't dumb. In a few moments, they quickly noticed the dilemma that 8th Miss was in. 9th Miss Fu smirked and began to provoke her. 8th sister hasn't said anything. You can't possibly be feeling embarrassed because you didn't bring enough money, right? Well, if you didn't bring enough, it's understandable. We're all unmarried ladies here, so it's normal that we don't have much money to spend. It's fine if we don't buy this and get something cheaper. The manager won't laugh at us. The manager served the wives and daughters of nobles and important officials every day. She was good at observing other people's expressions. Although she was disdainful of the group of girls before her, she didn't show it on her face. She simply nodded and played along. However, Miss Yuan felt even more keenly that she couldn't get out of the trap she had sprung on herself. She was used to acting high and mighty. Before Chu Lian had gotten married, she had always been competing with Chu Lian in every aspect of their lives. Though Chu Lian was now married and no longer in the Ying estate, there was still the main branch and the third branch to contend with. The master of the second branch, Chu Chijing, had no achievements to speak of, so the ladies of the second branch had always kept their heads a little lower when the other branches were around. This was also why 2nd Madam had given her 100 taels to spend upon finding out that she was going shopping with the sisters of the main and third branches. As tough as life was inside the estate, they couldn't lose face out in public. Miss Yuan's chest was heaving up and down from the frustration brought about by 9th Miss's words. However, the fact of the matter was, she just didn't have enough money, so she couldn't get off this high horse once she had gotten on. She could only bite her lip until it bled and grind her teeth into dust. Miss Yuan raised her head and was about to admit that she hadn't brought enough taels, when she spotted a familiar figure out of the corner of her eyes. Chapter 174, Digging a Hole for Herself, 3. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Miss Yuan was a little surprised, but the cogs in her mind quickly turned and she thought of a way to escape her troublesome situation. The effects were instant. The color in her face returned, and now that she had a solution, she immediately swallowed the words she had been about to say and recovered. 5th Miss and 9th Miss couldn't figure out why her expression had suddenly changed so quickly, like she'd been flipping through a book and gone from the climax to the resolution. Miss Yuan didn't mention the golden hairpin. Strangely enough, she took a step to the side and grabbed 5th Miss Sue's arm, acting like they were a pair of true sisters from the same branch as if the past minute had never happened. 5th sister, 9th sister, look across the street. Isn't that 6th sister? What a coincidence. We just bumped into her the moment we got a chance to go out. Miss Yuan pointed over to Hengsheng Medicine Hall. It just so happened that Chu Lian had turned around and led her 2 maidservants out of the medicine hall. One of the maidservants bent down to whisper into her ear, and Chu Lian seemed to be listening intently and nodding. Since she was out in the open, Miss Su and Miss Fu could recognize her clearly. Wasn't that Chu Lian, who must be enjoying a life of luxury after marrying into House Jingen? They watched as Chu Lian led her 2 maidservants across Jukyu Avenue. Weren't they heading this way and coming into Jinsha Pavilion? None of the staff had bothered to wait on them in Hengsheng Medicine Hall, and Chu Lian hadn't seen any precious medicinal ingredients on display on the counters, so she gave up. Furthermore, she wasn't too sure on what Countess Jingen's condition was. Medicine wasn't always good for the body, so it was better not to give her mother-in-law something to be ingested. After listening to Wenqing's recommendation, Chu Lian decided to head into Jinsha Pavilion for a look. When she reached the center of Jukyu Avenue, she looked up at Jinsha Pavilion and spotted some familiar figures. If not for the fact that the people inside had already seen her, she would have definitely turned right around and ran the other way. Associating with the ladies of her maiden family, especially with that half-sister of hers around, was never a good thing. Chu Lian couldn't resist looking up to the sky and wondering if her luck was that bad today. She had met with a bunch of unlucky events already, and now here was one more. Chu Lian pressed her lips and asked Wenqing, "Is it possible to run away now?" Wenqing saw that the three luxuriously dressed ladies were walking their way, clearly about to welcome their third young madam, so she could only heartlessly shatter Chu Lian's dream. "We can't, third young madam. They're on their way to welcome you. Wenqing, don't you know martial arts? Can't you fly into the air, walk on the walls, and take me away? I really don't want to meet those people." Wenqing had a difficult expression as she replied, "Third young madam, have you been reading too many stories? Even the dragon and tiger guards can't fly and walk on walls, let alone this servant and Wenlan." Chu Lian could only hang her head and sigh in distress. She was resigned to her fate. In a pitiful voice, Chu Lian said, "Then you'll have to protect me later, or else I'll get bullied by those people." Wenqing was speechless. She had already gone out with Chu Lian a few times before. Even if third young madam was a physically weak, young lady, had she ever really been bullied by anyone they met? It was always third young madam who angered her opponents until they could choke to death on their rage. She pressed her lips together, no longer willing to reply. She became even quieter than Wenlan. Chu Lian could only harumph, acting disappointed. "You girls are becoming more and more boring." In the time it took for their conversation to end, they had already reached the main entrance of Jinsha Pavilion and the other three misses had already come out to welcome them. Fifth miss was in the front with a slight smile. It made her round face look a little more innocent. "What a coincidence, sixth sister. Who could have thought that we'd meet here on Jukyu Avenue?" Miss Yuan stood behind Miss Su, eyeing Chu Lian up and down. Chu Lian was only wearing a plain, light blue dress with a simple jade hairpin in her hair. She didn't even have a single bangle on her wrist. This poor appearance looked even shabbier than when she had been living in the Ying estate. Chapter 175, Fishing for a Gift, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. It looked like Chu Lian wasn't living the life of luxury like she had expected. After jumping to conclusions, Miss Yuan's anger from Miss Su and Miss Fu's provocation subsided. Chu Lian nodded at these sisters of hers. She was a titled noble madam now, so she didn't need to make any bigger gestures of respect towards them. Miss Su invited Chu Lian into Jinsha Pavilion. In an abnormal display of behavior, Miss Yuan walked close to Chu Lian's side and bumped Wenlan away before grabbing onto Chu Lian's arms and calling her sixth sister. Chu Lian felt goosebumps rising all over her body thanks to Miss Yuan's overly intimate tone. Her gaze landed on Miss Yuan's hands wrapped around her left arm, and she didn't bother hiding the disgust she felt in her eyes. Miss Yuan's gaze met hers, but she acted as if she hadn't noticed how annoyed she was. Conversely, she acted as if they were best friends, flattering her with, "Sixth sister, we heard about your noble title. We just didn't have the time to visit you in the Jing'an estate to congratulate you. You won't blame this sister, would you?" Chu Lian snorted inwardly. If House Ying really cared about this matter, then they would have made it known to her, instead of waiting for Miss Yuan to mention it now after they had ran into each other. Although it was rare to get the honored lady title, it was just a low-ranking title without any imperial privilege. It wouldn't affect the court a single bit. To House Ying, she was no longer part of their family once she got married. Her parents didn't care about her either, so it was normal to receive such cold treatment from them. Luckily, she wasn't the original Chu Lian, so this was completely fine to her. What was there to complain about? She had more freedom now than they would have ever given her back there. Since House Ying had drawn the lines between them, they would have to think again if they wanted to make use of their connection in the future. Chu Lian really didn't want to play nice with them at all, but they were out in public now, so she had to care about keeping up House Jing'an's reputation. She said with good temper, "I won't blame you, it's just a small matter." Miss Yuan rolled her eyes, and a corner of her mouth hooked up. Her expression practically screamed, "At least you're smart enough to realize that." Wenqing almost choked on her anger upon seeing that expression. Her hands balled into fists as she felt outrage on behalf of her master. Miss Su was about 2 steps in front of them as she listened to their conversation. Her brows drew together in a frown. Afraid that Miss Yuan would chase Chu Lian away with her provocation, she quickly tried to smooth out the tense atmosphere. "Sixth sister, have you come to Jinsha Pavilion to pick out some accessories as well?" By this time, the Ying sisters had reached Jinsha Pavilion's main hall. Chu Lian didn't want to let them know that she was here to pick out a birthday present for Countess Jing'an, so she casually nodded. Miss Su's eyes darkened a little. Ever since the incident at the Dingyuan estate, she could feel the distance that Chu Lian was putting between her, Madame Rong, and the whole of House Ying. Back at the Dingyuan estate, she hadn't jumped out to support Chu Lian at the first hint of something wrong, and she had always felt guilty over it. Seeing Chu Lian's attitude towards them, she dropped the conversation. The main hall of Jinsha Pavilion was decorated elegantly and lavishly. There were small rest areas with tables, chairs, and incense burners behind the screens of the main hall for the noble madams and ladies to rest. There was even a tea room in the building in the back. When the 4 ladies sat down, maidservants came up to serve them sencha. The same manager came up to serve them personally. Miss Fu's eyes glanced over Chu Lian's outfit and a tinge of disdain filled her expression. The 3 branches of House Ying had never been at peace with each other. Even if Chu Lian had married out of House Ying, she was still a lady from the 2nd branch. From Miss Fu's perspective, she and Miss Yuan were on the same boat. Now that the chance had fallen into her lap, how could Miss Fu not make use of it? Miss Fu faked envy as she looked at Chu Lian. It was really a matter of pride for our House Ying when 6th sister received that personal title from the emperor. Grandmother even praised 6th sister in front of me 2 days ago. It even made me a little jealous. Grandmother also said that the imperial family usually bestows material awards when the emperor personally gives out an honored lady title. I heard that it's usually at least a few hundred taels of gold, and that's not counting the number of dresses and accessories you must have received. I'm really quite envious of you. Miss Su hadn't expected Miss Fu to have brought that topic up. She shot a warning look at Miss Fu. Miss Yuan's eyes abruptly lit up with greed before it was quickly replaced with jealousy and unhappiness. Chu Lian remained unmoved. She simply continued watching the ladies before her with wide eyes, inwardly wanting to laugh. Miss Fu hadn't even done her research before trying to make up this lie. The original Chu Lian had probably met the old madam of House Ying maybe twice a year at most. Any servant in the Ying estate knew that the old madam didn't like this daughter from the 2nd branch at all. How could she have possibly done something so out of character as praising her? Also, getting a reward of a few hundred gold taels from a measly honored lady title? Did she think that the imperial treasury was a mountain of gold and silver? Miss Fu's words were just too fantastical. She was probably only able to hoodwink the narrow-minded Miss Yuan. Even Jinsha Pavilion's manager hadn't moved at all. She clearly didn't think much about what Miss Fu had said. When Miss Fu finished speaking, she cast a measuring gaze over Chu Lian and Miss Yuan, smirking with bad intentions. The single motive she had for saying something like that was to provoke that 8th Miss, Chu Yuan. Chu Yuan had clearly gotten hooked. Back then, when they had both been unmarried ladies of House Ying, she had been better at Chu Lian in everything. Food, living standards, even her monthly allowance had been 10 taels higher than Chu Lian's. When Chu Lian had gotten married, 2nd Madam had used some underhanded measures to cut the original sum of 1,000 taels by half. She had been especially happy back then, because her mother had given her half of the confiscated silver. However, things were different now. It was bad enough that Chu Lian had gotten a noble title and a personal name from the emperor. She had actually gotten that much in rewards. A few hundred taels of gold. How could she hold back her jealousy? The plan that she had thought of just now came to mind again. Chapter 176, Fishing for a Gift, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Yuan held back the jealousy in her heart and forced herself to show a smile. I didn't expect sixth sister to have become so rich. No wonder you've come to Jinsha Pavilion. I took a liking to an accessory just now, it's only 100 or so taels of silver. That must be nothing to sixth sister. Perhaps sixth sister could buy it for your little sister? Chu Yuan wanted all of Chu Lian's gold to be hers. However, she couldn't just snatch all of it in one go, she could only resort to these small tricks to make away with it bit by bit. When Chu Yuan finished speaking, she shot a glance at the manager. The manager knew that these ladies were fighting, so she didn't say much. She simply brought out the accessory that Miss Yuan wanted earlier and placed it on the table in front of the ladies. She smiled as she introduced it to Chu Lian. Madam, this young miss in yellow took a liking to this jade bangle earlier, 50 taels. This golden hairpin with emerald inlays is the one that the lady next to you chose, 150 taels. As for the youngest miss here, she picked this pearl and gold bracelet, 60 taels. Not a single one of them was cheap. When the manager secretly glanced at the humbly dressed Chu Lian, she was surprised. Dressed like that, who could have recognized her as the subject of the latest gossip in the capital, honored Lady Jeannie? The manager only took a quick look and didn't dare to stare too openly. She was trying to guess if honored Lady Jeannie was really that poor, or if she had purposely dressed like this for a reason. Chu Lian reached out with her slender fingers and looked over each of the 3 accessories carefully. She kept nodding, seemingly satisfied. However, when she put the last item back into the brocade box, her brows drew together and she seemed a little put on the spot. As expected of accessories made by Jinsha Pavilion, they're made quite finely. As she said so, Chu Lian showed a slight trace of embarrassment on her face. Miss Fu and the others had been closely observing Chu Lian, so when Miss Fu spotted that minute change of expression, she inwardly snorted. She had guessed it right. So what if she was House Jingen's third young madam? Or honored Lady Jeannie? Judging by her shabby appearance today, she probably wasn't passing her days very well in the Jingen estate. She probably wouldn't even be able to take out 100 taels of silver, going by her expression. We're still young, so we chose simpler accessories. These 3 ornaments don't even add to 300 taels. It's not a small sum for us, but it must be barely anything to sixth sister. Sixth sister is an honored lady that the emperor personally named. Miss Fu added on evilly. Chu Lian rolled her eyes in her mind. If 300 taels isn't much, why don't you just rob me directly? 300 taels would be enough for a commoner's family to live out their whole lives. Chu Lian put on a troubled smile. Ninth sister, what are you saying? Miss Su had also detected Chu Lian's floundering, so she reprimanded Miss Fu. Ninth sister, how could we possibly ask sixth sister to pay for our shopping? Don't make trouble for her. Fifth sister, that's an unjust accusation. How could sixth sister be troubled by a mere 300 taels? Chu Lian could have claimed not to have any money in the past, because that was the truth. However, thanks to that honored lady title, she couldn't just claim to be poor now. Her noble title meant that her actions affected the reputation of the imperial family. With the personal name, she could be counted as half an imperial family member. If she claimed to be poor, then it would be the same as claiming that the imperial family was poor, disgracing the imperial family. Chu Lian looked more carefully at this ninth sister of hers. She hadn't expected a 13-year-old child to be trying such plots already. How was Miss Fu so confident that she would just take this lying down? Miss Yuan's gaze was fixed on that golden hairpin. It was made with fine detail, and the 3 similarly sized emeralds at the top of the hairpin were pretty. Under the lamplight, it would probably shine even more. When she thought of how this beautiful hairpin would soon be hers without having to spend a single coin, and how angry Chu Lian would be in the process of paying for it, her heart was filled with joy. Thus, Miss Yuan helped to further the ploy. Fifth sister, don't forget. It's not the same as before. Sixth sister is the honored Lady Jeannie now. Although Miss Su wanted to protect Chu Lian, the 2 younger sisters were collaborating against them, so she couldn't even think of a rebuttal. Finally, she could only look at Chu Lian apologetically. Chu Lian returned a troubled smile to her. Without saying whether she could afford to buy these accessories, she turned to the manager standing by the side to ask, "Manager, are there other designs? Take them out to show me." Miss Fu was delighted by Chu Lian's increasingly troubled expression. She didn't care whether Chu Lian would buy that bracelet for her or not. All she wanted was to make Chu Lian lose face and fall in disgrace. She wanted her to know that it wasn't easy to keep that noble title of hers. Once the news that Chu Lian had disgraced the imperial family's name spread out, someone would definitely pass it on to the emperor or empress. By then, before she could even settling down with her noble title, it would probably be taken back. Chu Lian would become the joke of the capital then. Chapter 177, Gifting a Jade Bangle, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. The female manager made a sound of agreement and quickly brought back quite a few sets of jewelry with the help of a maidservant. She placed them all in front of Chu Lian, one by one. This time, the accessories that the manager brought over were cheaper than the previous 3. The moment Chu Lian picked up a gold ring and glanced over it, she realized these new accessories couldn't compare to the 3 that the Haoxing sisters had chosen. Without exposing the manager's actions, she gently set the gold ring back down. However, Chu Lian didn't continue browsing through the new selection. Instead, she stood up and walked over to the counter. Everyone else exchanged glances. Even the manager didn't know what this plainly dressed honored Lady Genie was thinking. It wasn't until Chu Lian's soft voice rang out again that the manager regained her senses. "Manager, take these jade rings out. I'd like to have a look at them." The manager quickly strode over to the counter and slipped behind it. When she saw exactly what Chu Lian was pointing at, she was rendered speechless. The manager recovered a moment later. She swiftly removed the exquisite wooden box and laid it out for Chu Lian. Chu Lian had pointed to a pair of green Hatian jade thumb rings. One was larger while the other was smaller. It was clear that they formed a matching set. Green Hatian jade was a prized type of jade. Whatever the form, it was viewed as extremely valuable. Wearing rings on the thumb had not yet come into fashion in the Great Wu dynasty. In court, only military officials would wear rings on their thumbs, which helped in drawing bows. When Jinsha Pavilion had received this piece of Hatian jade back then, they hadn't planned on making thumb rings out of them. Unfortunately, there was a flaw in the raw material, so after much consideration by the master craftsman, they decided to make a pair anyway. It was the best usage for that particular piece of jade they had. However, not many people were interested in buying thumb rings, so the customers had always passed over this pair, until now. Thus, Chu Lian ended up reaping the benefits today. This exact pair of green Hatian jade thumb rings had appeared in the original story as well. Chu Lian had also chanced upon this set of rings, though it hadn't been at Jinsha Pavilion, and she had also bought them. The larger ring that was clearly sized for a man had ended up on Xiaobo Jian's hand. Xiaobo Jian had been a literary official. It was thanks to his wearing of this green jade thumb ring that thumb rings turned into a status symbol and a fashion trend. When held in hand, the Hatian jade rings felt slightly warm to the touch. The jade was of extremely high quality, its luster and color were top-notch. The smaller ring seemed to have been made for Chu Lian. When she put it on her thumb, the vibrant green of the jade complemented her fair fingers. It was beautiful. Even the ladies from Haoxing were a little dazed from the sight. They had never thought that an accessory that only roughshod military men wore could look this good on a woman's hand. If it was matched by a full set of riding clothes, then the effect would be greatly magnified. Chu Lian was satisfied, of course. She looked at the manager and indicated with her eyes that she would like an explanation about the rings. After the manager got over her surprise, she calmed down and stated, "Madam, this one doesn't dare to hide anything from you. What you're holding now is a pair of thumb rings. It's made from the highest quality green Hatian jade. The amount of jade we received back then was limited, so all we could make was these. But hardly anyone is interested in buying thumb rings, they've been on display for quite some time now without any buyers. If Madam would truly like to buy these, this one will take the initiative and make an offer of 300 taels of silver for you. Is this agreeable to you?" Chu Lian nodded as she listened. It was the same as the novel. This pair of rings was much cheaper than normal Hatian jade accessories, as expected. Jinsha Pavilion's manager was rather honest and had given her a fair price for them. However, 300 taels wasn't a small sum, either. Chu Lian didn't make any mention of buying them, but she didn't let the manager put the rings away. Instead, she took a look at some other accessories. Miss Fu was right behind Chu Lian. At an angle where no one could see, she sneered as she thought, if you can't afford it, why bother asking at all? Does she think that she can buy some time and wait for someone to pay up for her instead? Miss Yuan was also starting to become impatient. Sixth sister, after looking at so many accessories, are you finally done browsing? Chu Lian turned to glance at her. She set down the orchid-shaped jade hairpin in her hands and actually pulled out a smile for Miss Yuan. Is anything the matter? It seems like eighth sister is more anxious than I am. Without waiting for Miss Yuan's angry rebuttal, Miss Fu took the initiative to speak up next. Her smile concealed a certain hidden meaning as she said, Sixth sister, you couldn't have possibly left your house in such a hurry that you forgot to bring any money with you, right? It's all right, we can forego those accessories. Miss Su was angered. Eighth sister, ninth sister, that's enough from you too. Miss Fu was keeping a close eye on Chu Lian's expression. Although Chu Lian seemed calm on the surface, there was a hint of panic in her almond-shaped eyes. Thus, Miss Fu was satisfied by the effect of her provocation. She was inwardly thinking, let's see how she tries to recover from this now. The manager maintained her silence and secretly peeked at Chu Lian. She didn't really believe that the plainly dressed Chu Lian had more than 1,000 taels to spend on these accessories. Chu Lian looked at Miss Su and reassured her. Fifth sister, there's no need to worry. I think that jade bangle is a good choice. It will look good on you. Then, she turned and shot a look at Miss Yuan and Miss Fu. A bright spark shone in her black eyes. The sudden difference in her expression made Miss Yuan and Miss Fu uneasy for a moment. They couldn't speak. The traces of reluctance and worry had completely disappeared from Chu Lian's eyes. Instead, they shone bright with humor and cunning, as brilliant as the stars in the night sky. She turned to face the stunned manager and said, Manager, please pack up the 3 accessories that these ladies picked out just now and this pair of thumb rings. Wenqing, follow the manager and settle the bill. Chapter 178, Gifting a Jade Bangle, 2. This chapter has been stolen from Volaranovels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian had already looked around at the other accessories in Jinsha Pavilion. Although their workmanship and material were high quality, their designs were old and simple. There weren't many fresh designs in the lot either. It would be much better if she made a design herself and gave it to a master craftsman at Jinsha Pavilion to craft for her. The manager had thought that she couldn't afford a single accessory at all. Who could have expected that she would be so generous when the time came? She actually bought the set of rings she had taken a liking to, as well as all the accessories the 3 ladies had picked. Altogether, that was a purchase of 600 taels of silver. This was a huge sale. The manager smiled widely from ear to ear and said, Since Madam is buying all these accessories, this one will take the initiative to round off the final figure to 600 taels. Of course, the pair of jade earrings this one offered for free earlier will be counted in. Hearing this, Wenqing took out 600 taels worth of banknotes from her purse and passed it over to the manager. After the manager checked the banknotes, she took care to pack up the accessories properly in their wooden boxes, and passed these over to Wenqing and Wenlan. Chu Lian smiled until her almond-shaped eyes turned into upturned crescents as she looked at the 3 ladies. The 3 sisters from House Ying couldn't hide the shock on their faces. However, there were different nuances to their shock. Miss Su's face carried a trace of concern, while Miss Yuan's smile was full of the secret delight taken in an unexpected windfall. Meanwhile, Miss Fu was showing resentment and dissatisfaction from not seeing her plots come to fruition. Miss Fu sourly remarked, Sixth sister has really changed her fortunes since getting that noble title. I've really broadened my horizons today. This time, Chu Lian didn't remain quiet and looked right at Miss Fu with a broad smile. Thank you for your praise, ninth sister. Miss Fu was so choked by those words that she couldn't even maintain the fake expression on her face. A hint of her unhappiness shone through. Miss Yuan's gaze darted to the boxes that Wenlan was carrying. She hated that she couldn't take that emerald hairpin she wanted immediately. Only Miss Su followed behind Chu Lian and watched her with concern, worried that she had spent too much of her money after getting provoked just now. After buying the accessories, Chu Lian didn't want to stay in Jinsha Pavilion any longer. The 4 ladies of House Ying were escorted to Jinsha Pavilion's entrance by the manager. When they reached the place where Chu Lian's carriage had stopped, she paused and turned. She took one of the boxes from Wenlan and gave it to Miss Su, who was right behind her. "Fifth sister, this is the jade bangle you wanted. Take it." Miss Su rejected it and shook her head. "Sixth sister, this bangle is too expensive, I can't take it. You should bring it home with you to wear." Miss Su had never expected nor wanted Chu Lian to give her that jade bangle at all. Chu Lian glared at her playfully and shoved the jade bangle into her hands. "Fifth sister, this jade bangle doesn't suit me at all. It'll be useless if I bring it home with me." She even showed her wrists to Miss Su. Chu Lian's wrists were much more slender than Miss Su's, so the jade bangle really didn't suit her. Miss Yuan's eyes were wide open and her heart was filled with anxiety as she watched the 2 of them politely passing the box here and there. She really wanted to help Miss Su accept the gift, so that Miss Su's rejection wouldn't affect the likelihood of Chu Lian giving her the golden hairpin. When Miss Su finally accepted that jade bangle, she heaved a sigh of relief. Miss Yuan's gaze immediately locked onto Chu Lian next. Miss Su had no other choice but to accept the bangle. She felt guilty and happy at the same time. Chu Lian's willingness to give her something meant that the relationship between them could still be repaired. "Then I'll thank sixth sister here. The next time I have something good in my hands, I'll definitely think of sixth sister first." Chu Lian smiled at her and patted the back of her hand. Next, she set her eyes on Miss Yuan and Miss Fu. Miss Yuan was staring at her with an almost frenzied gaze, while Miss Fu had been going around with an ugly expression since getting slapped in the face by her actions in Jinsha Pavilion. She couldn't even be bothered to fake a pleasant smile, and instead, pursed her lips without speaking. Chu Lian inwardly rolled her eyes. Miss Fu was still expecting a gift from her even in this state. Did Miss Fu really think that she was a saint or something? Chu Lian looked away from them and looked to Miss Su instead. With a warm expression, she said, "Fifth sister, it's getting late now. It's about time for me to head home. Let's say our goodbyes here. I'll send you an invite for a flower appreciation party at the Jingen estate some other time." Miss Su smiled and nodded. Goodbyes done, Chu Lian immediately turned to her carriage, leaving a slender silhouette for Miss Fu and the others to gaze upon. Miss Yuan was momentarily stunned. Without even thinking, she reached out her hand towards Chu Lian as if she wanted to bring her back. When Miss Yuan recovered her wits, she couldn't help but chase after her. "Sixth sister, wait." Chu Lian stopped and turned around. She blinked innocently and tilted her head to one side in mock confusion. "Eighth sister, is there something the matter?" Miss Yuan pressed her lips together, her eyes full of disbelief. She actually forgot her golden hairpin. How could she do that? She had picked that golden hairpin first. It should be hers. Miss Yuan exercised the last of her restraint to hold back the unhappiness and frustration in her heart and managed to squeeze out a slightly strained smile. She tried to remind Chu Lian by saying, "Sixth sister, have you forgotten something?" Chu Lian looked upwards, as if she was giving a serious amount of thought to this question. After a moment, she smiled as she met Miss Yuan's expectant gaze and shook her head. "My memory's still good. I remembered everything important, and didn't forget anything." "What?" Miss Yuan's eyes widened and her hands curled into fists under her sleeves. She angrily said, "Since sixth sister can't remember, then I'll remind sixth sister. That golden hairpin." Chapter 179. Who Said It's For You? 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volara novels. Please read from the original source. Chu Lian acted as if she had just realized what was going on. "Oh, does eighth sister mean that golden hairpin I just bought from Jinsha Pavilion? What's wrong with it?" When Miss Yuan saw that Chu Lian was still pretending to have forgotten about their deal, she wanted to charge right up to Wenlan and take the golden hairpin out of her hands. "I was the one who chose that hairpin," Chu Lian nodded. That's right, eighth sister did choose that golden hairpin. To Miss Yuan, Chu Lian admitting this fact was the equivalent of a box of tinder sparking the flame of hope in her eyes. But her next words left Miss Yuan utterly dumbfounded. However, I was the one who paid for it. Does eighth sister think that anything you take a liking to is automatically yours? Aren't you too naive? This statement completely blindsided her. Although Miss Yuan now knew there wasn't much of a chance that she would get that golden hairpin from Chu Lian, she continued to argue anyway. But you gave that jade bangle to fifth sister. So I did. But I never thought of giving the golden hairpin to you. Did you ever hear me say anything like that? Chu Lian threw down her final words and turned to walk towards her carriage. Now that her back was facing those three sisters of Haoxing, she couldn't resist showing a mischievous smile. Wenqing and Wenlan felt just as refreshed from that scene. Their hearts were filled with the deepest admiration for their master. What great face-slapping skills their master had. What a delight. This outcome was out of Miss Fu's expectations. She stood rooted to the spot, too stunned from the sudden twist of events to move. It took her a long time to recover. Miss Yuan's eyes were filled with tears. How could Chu Lian do this to her? How could she be so shameless? That golden hairpin should be hers. The Haoxing sisters' trap was too obvious. From the very beginning, Chu Lian had never intended to let their schemes succeed. Buying all the jewelry they had picked out. Part of the plan. Giving Miss Su the jade bangle. Also part of her plan, to make the other two think she had indeed bought those accessories for them. However, Chu Lian had intentionally never once said that she was going to give them to them. Buying the accessories was one thing. Whether she was going to give them to them was a whole other matter. For a moment, Miss Su watched Chu Lian's back as she departed. Then, she turned her gaze back onto Miss Yuan and Miss Fu, and with a sneer, she said to them, "It's getting late. We should be going home, too." Going home? I don't want to go home. I want that golden hairpin. In her rage, Miss Yuan began to throw a childish tantrum. Since you want it so much, go back to Jinsha Pavilion with 150 taels and you'll have one. Miss Su was done being polite. While she had a kind personality, she wasn't someone to be bullied. Miss Yuan wasn't from the same family branch anyway, so she didn't have any reason to give in to her whining. Miss Yuan felt very aggrieved. Tears fell one by one from her eyes, shining like pearls. She had been spoiled rotten by second madam, so though she was already 14 this year, her attitude was still careless and thoughtless. The moment things didn't go her way, she would throw a tantrum. Even her handmaid was embarrassed for her. Miss Yuan looked around for someone she could childishly badger until they gave in, like back at home, but Miss Su and Miss Fu simply looked at her with disdain. However, by looking at her surroundings, she actually found someone she could use her charms on. Not too far off, a middle-aged man was walking in their direction with a manservant behind him. Who else could it be but the second master of Haoxing, Chu Chizheng? The moment Miss Yuan caught sight of Chu Chizheng, she dashed over and hugged him. "Daddy." Upon leaving the Pan estate, Chu Chizheng had bumped into Haoxing's two young masters on the street. He had heard from them that the three young ladies were at Jinsha Pavilion, and thus, had rushed over. When he looked down and saw that his daughter's nose was red and her face was covered in the tear tracks, Chu Chizheng frowned. Who had dared to bully his daughter? He tenderly patted her hair and said, "What happened to our little Yuan? Why are you so sad?" "Daddy. Sixth sister stole my golden hairpin. I was clearly the one who picked it out." Miss Yuan's voice softened as she complained to her father. Chu Chizheng's brows furrowed together even more. "Chu Lian." Miss Su was about to explain when Miss Fu pulled her away. Miss Fu lowered her voice and whispered into Miss Su's ear, "Fifth sister, it's best if you don't bother with the second branch's family matters. Beware of biting off more than you can chew." Miss Su hesitated for a moment, but ultimately chose to keep silent. This second uncle of hers was known for being headstrong. Even if she tried to cut in, he probably wouldn't listen to her. Miss Yuan had finally found someone she could depend on. She looked up at Chu Chizheng with her teary eyes and pointed in the direction that Chu Lian had left in. At this moment, Chu Lian had just walked up to her carriage. Wenlan had retrieved a small stool from inside the carriage and was preparing to help Chu Lian up. Chu Chijing didn't have any male heirs, and he only had a single daughter left with him in the Yingguo estate. He had spoiled his second daughter like a pearl in the palm of his hand since she was young. Of course he was going to help rectify this injustice she had suffered. Thus, he strode towards Chu Lian together with Chu Yuan, even though he had only heard just a few words from his daughter. Right before she could get into her carriage, Chu Lian noticed her father walking towards her from the corners of her eyes. Thus, she stopped moving and stood by the carriage, brows slightly drawn together as Chu Chijing came closer. When he was close enough, Chu Lian made a slight bow and gave a proper greeting to Chu Chijing. "Does father have any urgent business with me?" Chu Chijing's features were pretty good for his age, and he might even be considered a suave middle-aged uncle. What a pity that he was currently frowning with a serious, unhappy expression. It utterly spoiled his natural good looks. He didn't bother beating around the bush with Chu Lian and simply stated, "Return that golden hairpin to your sister. Your sister said that it's hers. As her older sister, you should give in to your younger sister." If she wasn't sure that she was a legitimate daughter of House Ying, Chu Lian might have suspected that she wasn't of his blood. He was the father of both of them, but Chu Chijing's heart was clearly too biased towards one daughter. Luckily she wasn't the original Chu Lian and Chu Chijing was simply some middle-aged stranger she had met a few times. If she really took him as her father, wouldn't she choke to death based on his words alone? Chapter 180, Who Said It's For You? 2. This chapter has been stolen from Novels. Please read from the original source. Now that she had someone to back her up, Miss Yuan looked at Chu Lian in delight, flaunting her power. Chu Lian was too lazy to argue with this brain-dead pair of father and daughter. She rolled her eyes with an exaggerated motion, without any care for her image. She then snorted and said, "Daddy, why did you come to interrogate me without first making sure of the truth? Those not in the know might even think that I'm not really your daughter." Chu Chijing glared at her in disbelief that she would say such words. His rage shot through the roof and he was about to vent his temper and give her a sound scolding. However, Chu Lian didn't give him the chance. "Next time, I hope Daddy can investigate the truth properly before coming to interrogate your daughter. Don't just place all the blame on me without any proof. My husband isn't around and I'm alone, so I can't withstand your accusations. It was me who bought that golden hairpin you mentioned. 150 taels, no more, no less. If you don't believe me, you can ask the manager over at Jinsha Pavilion. If 8th sister likes it, Daddy can buy one for 8th sister there. I'm sure that Daddy won't be bothered about spending such a trivial sum of money since you're such a great and mighty man." Chu Lian didn't continue any further. She boarded her carriage by herself. With a crack of the driver's whip, Chu Lian's carriage departed with the escort of her family servants, disappearing from Chu Chijing's sight. Chu Chijing only knew Chu Lian as the daughter who sometimes craved for his approval. He hadn't expected her to completely abandon all consideration for his pride. She had disgraced him without a second thought. His face was as black as a pot. However, he couldn't find anything wrong with what Chu Lian had said, either. Finally, he could only hold back his anger and question Miss Yuan. "Is what your 6th sister said true?" Miss Yuan knew that her plot had failed again, so she harumphed and said, "6th sister bought that golden hairpin, but I was clearly the one who chose it first." As she spoke, she started to cry. She looked up at Chu Chijing with a pitiful expression. "Daddy, I really like that golden hairpin. Maybe Daddy can buy a hairpin for little Yuan." Buying a hairpin? Chu Chijing's face froze. Second Madam was strictly in charge of the finances at home, and he didn't have much squared away in his private funds. He usually went out to play, drink, and have fun. How could he possibly have 100 taels to buy a hairpin? What a dangerous thought that Miss Yuan had. Nonsense. Stop thinking about buying this and that. All you know how to do is spend money on accessories. Girls your age should be doing more productive things, like focusing on your studies. Chu Chijing tossed his sleeves and left. Due to Chu Lian's words, his chest was full of rage. When Miss Yuan saw that her plan hadn't come to fruition, She wiped her tears with a handkerchief and looked down with reddened eyes. Her heart was full of hate for Chu Lian. Miss Fu and Miss Su were watching from afar. Miss Fu's lips curled up and she mocked, "Ever since Sixth Sister got married, she's been getting more and more difficult to deal with." However, Miss Su didn't share her thoughts. If only she could be as straightforward and decisive as Sixth Sister was. On the way back to the Jing'an estate, Chu Lian leaned against the wall and rested her eyes for a while. Wenqing and Wenlan sat to one side and carefully watched her expression. Finally, Wenqing couldn't hold back any longer and began to try to console her. "Third young madam, please don't think too much about what just happened. You're now a member of House Jing'an. You have third young master, madam, and the matriarch." Hearing this, Chu Lian opened her eyes to look at Wenqing. She suddenly smiled and reached out to pinch Wenqing's nose. "You silly girl, what are you thinking about? I'm not angry." Her mother-in-law and grandmother-in-law both treated her very well. Chu Lian was already satisfied. As for that crazy, absentee husband of hers, forget it. She had never thought of expecting anything from him. When Wenqing saw that Chu Lian's smile seemed to be genuine and she really wasn't bothered by what happened just now, she heaved a sigh of relief together with Wenlan. Following that, she purposely tried to cheer her master up with a couple jokes. Chu Lian rolled her eyes. "All right, enough. Your jokes aren't funny at all." Wenqing covered her smile with a hand. "If third young madam has any funnier jokes, then why don't you share them with us servants?" Chu Lian coughed once for effect. "Then listen carefully." Wenqing and Wenlan nodded seriously. Chu Lian coughed again into her fist before sending a sneaky glance at Wenqing and Wenlan with wide, watery eyes. "If a fatty jumps from a 9-story pagoda, what will he turn into?" Wenqing and Wenlan thought long and hard, and gave all sorts of guesses. They even tried guessing a god, but Chu Lian still shook her head. Wenqing was burning with curiosity since she couldn't guess the answer. With a coquettish lilt, she pleaded, "Third young madam, please tell us the answer tilde. What will he turn into?" Dead serious, Chu Lian stated the answer without a single break in her expression. "What else could it be? He'd turn into a dead fatty, of course. What kind of human can survive a fall from a 9-story tall pagoda?" Upon hearing the final answer, Wenqing and Wenlan looked like they just ate a mouthful of flies. Their mouths opened and closed, but in the end, they couldn't manage to say anything. From then on, the two maidservants never asked third young madam for a joke ever again. Her jokes were way too lame. They weren't funny at all. Sob sob sob. When she saw Wenqing and Wenlan's expressions, Chu Lian couldn't restrain herself any longer and fell back laughing inside the carriage. Although her maiden family didn't love her and her husband wasn't interested in her, at least her handmaids were all really cute. With these sisters by her side, she didn't feel the slightest bit lonely at all. TL note: I closed submissions for the messages for TMR's author. I'm going to be compiling all the messages and translating some of the best ones so she'll be able to understand them all. For those who gave permission, your messages will be posted on Volar to share with everyone. Thanks for participating. Love. Chapter 181, Having Meet in the Army, 1. This chapter has been stolen from Volar novels. Please read from the original source. The capital was currently in early autumn, signaling the arrival of the strong winds that would blow and disturb the people's daily lives every once in a while. On the other hand, the northern border, specifically the city of Liangju, was already in the early stages of a desolate winter. The roaming nomads had already stopped grazing their herds. They set up tents instead, storing up food to pass their winter. In the army camp just 5 kilometers away from Liangju, other than handling their normal daily chores, the army was still training for battle. Smoke was rising from the cookhouse in the camp. It was already time for dinner. The setting sun hung at the boundary of the horizon, casting its red light over the wide, vast plains, breathing additional color into the scenery. However, no matter how vibrant and warm the colors, they couldn't erase the cold, piercing winter winds that blew over the plains at this time of year. A crisp, loud signal began to ring throughout the camp, transmitted to every nook and cranny. The moment the last section of training on the grounds ended, there was a roar of male voices as the captains shouted to begin eating. Even though it was the start of winter, the northern border troops were on standby, so they only got to eat 2 meals a day. One in the morning and one at night. After training for the whole day and getting drenched in sweat, the troops were so hungry that they could eat a horse, each. When the captain gave the order, they dashed towards the cookhouse at a speed that even the general's fastest shot couldn't match. In Captain Guo's camp, more than 300 elite soldiers charged towards the cookhouse like hungry wolves. The tall, burly Captain Guo followed behind his soldiers. His tanned face carried a smile as he mock-scolded his speedy troops. 2 men followed behind Captain Guo. The one on the left was sturdy, and even taller than Captain Guo by a full head. His eyes were like deep pools and his nose was tall and straight. He looked to be about 20 or so. However, his good looks were obscured by a thick, full beard covering half of his face. What a pity. The man on the right was about as tall as Captain Guo. He was clean-shaven, but his face was too square and his eyes were too small. Furthermore, his body was about 1 size bigger than Captain Guo's, so he wasn't as good-looking as his companion. However, this burly, square-faced man seemed to be rather young as well. Captain Guo patted the backs of the 2 people next to him. Zhixiang, Yuhong, you should manage these brats carefully. They're too rowdy. Zhixiang was He Changdi's name, while Yuhong was the burly square-faced man, of course. Due to Count Jing'an and Prince Jin's influence, although this was He Changdi's first time serving in the northern border troops under Captain Guo, he was able to start off a little higher than the rest thanks to his status. He had managed to join as a lieutenant. In the Great Wu dynasty, the rank of lieutenant meant that he had a small group of about 100 men or so under his command. Captain Guo had 3 lieutenants serving under him. Other than He Changdi and Xiao Yuhong, there was also a man in his 30s, Zhong Mai. He Changdi and Xiao Yuhong quickly chuckled and agreed with the captain. When Captain Guo saw that they had already started fighting over the food over at the cookhouse, he quickened his pace. Let's move a little faster before those hungry brats eat up all of our food. Captain Guo was only joking. The army cooks would always keep his and his 3 lieutenants' meals aside. But even with this little courtesy, Captain Guo treated his soldiers like brothers. His meals were exactly the same fare as what the troops ate, although his portions might be a little larger. He was an upright, honest person who never ordered any separate or special meals from the army cooks. The only time he had ever eaten something different from the troops was when he had insisted on leading their training even while he was sick. The old army cook hadn't been able to bear with seeing this, so he had specially made some wild chicken soup for him. That had already been a whole year ago. However, the northern border was a poor place to be anyway. Although the troops were regularly given provisions and money, there was still a limit to the circulation of goods in this place. The army provisions were also rough fare. When they weren't preparing for battle, it was only enough to fill the stomachs. Even if Captain Guo wanted to have something better, there wasn't really much else to eat. Chapter 182, Having Meat in the Army, 2. When the 3 of them reached the cookhouse, the old army cook quickly brought out 3 large porcelain bowls and placed them on a small wooden table, which had 4 wooden stools placed around it. It was still dusk. Under the cover of the tent flap, which blocked the wind from reaching them, they could use the fading light to have a rough meal of army fare. Captain Guo had his 2 assistants sit down first before pointing at the 3 bowls on the table. It's been a tiring day, let's just eat. He Changdi and Xiao Yuhong didn't stand on courtesy and picked up some chopsticks to begin wolfing down their food. Today's dinner was Chinese olive porridge with some cabbage thrown in. There were 2 wheat pancakes thrown on top of the porridge and no meat. The porridge itself was simply flavored with a little bit of coarse salt. Since it was the lowest quality of salt, there was a strange taste to it as well. With this kind of food, they couldn't be picky about the taste. They could only use it to fill their stomachs out of a lack of better options. Xiao Yuhong finished off a wheat pancake in 2 or 3 bites. When he tried to swallow it down, it got stuck in his throat. He had to gulp down quite a few mouthfuls of the porridge before he could push that piece of pancake down into his stomach. His face was flushed red from the exertion, and he stared into his bowl in a daze. Although he looked as strong as a bull, He was younger than Changdi by a year at only 19 years old. He had joined the army just last year, and his family was also a military official house. Although his family had been strict with his education, he had never lacked for any sort of food ever since he was young. Brother Guo, brother He, at every mealtime, I really miss eating the meat that my mother cooked. Back at home, I still thought that meat was too fatty and oily. If I could have a whole pot of it now, I'd finish it all up and lick it clean. Captain Guo found it funny and pointed at his bowl. What's wrong? You still have half your bowl left. If you can't finish it, give it to me, I'll help you eat it up. Xiao Yuhong quickly pulled his bowl into a protective embrace, just like a little puppy trying to protect its food. The others couldn't hold back their laughter at the sight. No way. Brother Guo, I'm not done yet. Didn't you say you wanted to eat meat? But there isn't any. If there was meat, who would eat this porridge or these pancakes? Changdi held his bowl and slowly ate his meal. Although he ate pretty quickly, he didn't look like a starving wolf at all, and even seemed to have an elegant grace in his actions. It was just his beard that seemed a little inconvenient. Some porridge would get on it from time to time. Changdi simply buried his head and ate his meal, acting deaf to the conversation of the two people beside him. Right after Captain Guo and Xiao Yuhong finished talking, a man's voice joined in, easy like a refreshing breeze. Who says there's no meat? What? There's meat. Xiao Yuhong immediately stood up, his eyes almost shining red from his hunger. He hadn't had a bite of meat for months now. Thanks to his excitement, his small eyes had grown wide. The man who spoke walked over with an empty bowl. He was about as tall as Changdi, but without a beard on his face. He was also wearing a lieutenant's uniform, but he was clearly older than Changdi by a whole decade. He was the third lieutenant under Captain Guo's command, Zhong Mai. Zhong Mai had been exempted from training today due to an old wound flaring up. After resting in his tent for half the day, he had wandered over to the cookhouse for dinner. For some reason, the previously silent Changdi suddenly froze. Xiao Yuhong was practically drooling from the thought of having meat to eat. He quickly moved over to Zhong Mai, face sticking out as if he could smell the meat. He pleaded in a friendly tone, "Brother Zhong, you just said that there's meat to eat. You can't forget about your brother here." Zhong Mai smiled mysteriously before reaching out with one finger and pointing at the now rigid Changdi. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.